2 days shy of her 41st birthday, shotgun blasts ripped through the quiet hills of the Indian Territory. She was shot in the back, a coward's ambush. The woman they called the Bandit Queen lay dead in the dirt, just feet from her own gate. The dime novels painted her as a female Jesse James, a ruthless outlaw. But that's the legend. How does a girl who mastered Greek and the piano, born to a respectable family, end her days this way? Today, we separate the truth from the lies to find the real Myra Maybelle Shirley and to ask the question that still haunts these hills. Who wanted her dead? Before the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley. She wasn't born in a dusty outlaw camp, but into a life of relative comfort in Carthage, Missouri. Her father, John Shirley, was a respected farmer, innkeeper, and judge, a man of property and standing. Their home sat on the very edge of civilization, where the rolling prairies gave way to the rugged ancient Ozark Hills. It was a land with a soul much like Appalachia's, a place of tight-knit clans, fierce independence, and memories as long and deep as the valleys themselves. The roots of that spirit ran deep in Myra's blood. Her mother, Elizabeth Hatfield Shirley, came from the same line as the notorious Hatfields of the West Virginia-Kentucky border. This wasn't just a distant relation, it was a heritage. It meant that Myra was born into a world where honor was defended with fists and firearms, where loyalty to family was the highest law, and where an insult was a debt that would one day be paid in full. This was the unwritten code of the mountains, a code she understood long before she ever read a law book. On the surface, however, Myra was being molded into a proper Southern lady. Her father sent her to the Carthage Female Academy, a place of refinement and learning. She studied the classics, mastered Greek and Latin, and could fill the Shirley home with the beautiful, complex notes of a piano sonata. She was intelligent, articulate, and poised, everything a daughter of a prominent family was expected to be. She was destined for a life of quiet dignity, of ball gowns and polite conversation. But beneath the corset and silk beat the heart of a rebel. The same girl who could quote Greek philosophers was more at home in the saddle, racing her horse through the woods with a freedom most women of her time could only dream of. She preferred the company of her older brother, Bud, and his friends, learning from them the ways of the wilderness. She could handle a shotgun with a skill that shamed grown men and knew the hidden trails of the Ozarks as if they were lines on the palm of her hand. Two worlds were at war inside this young woman: the polished, respectable world her father was building for her, and the wild, untamed world of the hills that flowed in her Hatfield blood. For a time, she could walk in both. But a storm was gathering on the horizon of America, a storm of fire and steel that would sweep across the nation, and it would force Myra Maybelle Shirley to choose, once and for all, which world she truly belonged to. Little did she know that choice would burn the life she knew to the ground. If the Ozark Hills were the anvil of Myra's character, the Civil War was the hammer that shattered it and reforged it into something hard and sharp. When the war came, it didn't just divide the nation, it ripped through Missouri, turning neighbor against neighbor in a savage guerrilla conflict. The Shirley family didn't hesitate. Their loyalty was to the Confederacy, and their home soon became a clandestine way station for the most feared Southern partisans, the bushwhackers. Men like William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson, men who fought with a cold fury, found refuge under the Shirley roof. And riding with them were boys who would become legends in their own right, the James brothers and the Younger brothers. This was the world that consumed Myra Maybelle. She saw these men not as outlaws, but as heroes defending their homes. And her greatest hero was her own brother, Edwin, whom everyone called Bud. He was everything she admired: brave, defiant, and free. When he joined the bushwhackers, Myra's war began. The polite young lady from the academy vanished, replaced by a cunning operative for the Southern cause. Legends say she would use her charm and education to flirt with Union officers, prying information from them about troop movements, which she would then pass on to her brother and his comrades. She became a scout, a spy, a vital part of the shadow war being fought in the Missouri hills. For a time, it must have felt like a dangerous, righteous adventure. She was fighting alongside her brother, defending her family's beliefs. The risk was real, but so was the adrenaline, the sense of purpose. She was no longer just a girl playing piano. She was a player in the great bloody drama of her time. But this was no adventure, and the price of this war was about to be brought to her door in the most brutal way imaginable. In 1864, the hammer fell. Federal troops, tired of the constant raids and ambushes, hunted down Bud Shirley. He was trapped, cornered, and killed. For 16-year-old Myra, the news wasn't just devastating, it was the end of her world. The light of her life, her protector, her idol, was gone, slain by the very men she saw as foreign invaders. In that moment, her girlish patriotism and grief curdled into something far darker, a cold, permanent, all-consuming hatred. A hatred for the government, for its uniforms, for its laws. They had taken her brother, and in doing so, they had taken a part of her soul. The war might end for the country, but for Myra Shirley, it would never be over. She would spend the rest of her life fighting the victors. After the war, the Shirley family fled to Texas, seeking a new life from the ashes of the old. But for Myra, peace was a foreign country. Her heart, forged in hatred, was drawn to the fire. She found that fire in the eyes of the men who, like her brother Bud, refused to surrender. Men like the charismatic Cole Younger, a childhood friend and now a notorious outlaw. Rumors would later whisper of a passionate affair, claiming her daughter Pearl was his. It was a romantic story, but likely just that, a story. The truth, however, was no less dangerous. Her first husband was Jim Reed, another former bushwhacker who couldn't trade his pistol for a plow. With him, Myra stepped fully into the world of the outlaw. Their life was a blur of stolen horses and dodging posses, a frantic existence on the run. In this chaos, her two children, Pearl and Eddie, were born. But this was no family portrait. It was a partnership born of war and rebellion, and it was destined to end in blood. In 1874, Jim Reed's luck ran out. The news that reached Myra was cold and brutal. Her husband had been shot down, not in a blaze of glory, but by an acquaintance who valued the reward money more than friendship. At 26, Myra was a widow, a mother of two, and officially branded the accomplice of a dead bandit. This was the world she had chosen, a world with no honor among thieves. So she moved deeper into the shadows, to a place where the law of the United States was thin and the old ways were strong, the Indian Territory of Oklahoma. There, she met and married Sam Starr, a man from a proud Cherokee family. This wasn't just a marriage, it was the founding of a dynasty. On their land, tucked away in the rugged hills, they established a stronghold. It had a name that was a tribute to her old friends and a warning to her new enemies, Younger's Bend. Younger's Bend wasn't a ranch. It was a sanctuary for the damned. It was a place where men on the run, men like Jesse James and the Younger brothers themselves, could find a hot meal, a fresh horse, and a place to lay low, protected by the cunning of its queen. The air there was thick with the smell of wood smoke, whiskey, and paranoia. Every rider on the horizon was either a friend or a hangman. This was the heart of darkness, a kingdom built on stolen goods and guarded by guns. Here, the final transformation of Myra Maybelle Shirley was complete. She was no longer just a bandit's wife, she was the mastermind. She never led a charge, her hands weren't on the triggers during the robberies. Her weapons were her intellect and her will. She planned the heists, fenced the stolen property, bribed officials, and used her deep knowledge of the law to tangle up prosecutors in court. And she crafted an image that became a legend. She would ride into town on a fine horse, sitting side saddle in a velvet dress like a proper lady, but on her hips, for all the world to see, rested 2 Colt revolvers. She could quote classical poetry one moment and arrange the sale of a stolen herd the next. This walking contradiction, the refined lady and the criminal queen, was her armor and her declaration of war. She had created a monster, and her name was Belle Starr. The 2 shotgun blasts echoed through the hills and then faded into an unnerving quiet. Belle Starr's horse, spooked and riderless, galloped the rest of the way to the ranch house, its panicked whinny the first alarm. Her daughter Pearl, hearing the sound, ran out to see what was wrong. The discovery she made in the mud of the road, just outside their own gate, would become the final bloody chapter of her mother's legend. The bandit queen was dead, her velvet riding habit stained with the earth and her own blood, her back riddled with buckshot. News of a murder like that travels fast, even in the isolated Indian territory. It moved from ranch to ranch on the lips of breathless riders, then crackled across the telegraph wires to the newspapers in Fort Smith and beyond. The death of Belle Starr was an event. For the lawmen, it was the closing of a long and frustrating case file. For the dime novelists, it was a dramatic ending they couldn't have written better themselves. For the locals, it was a source of fear and feverish gossip. The queen was dead, but who had dared to kill her? Soon enough, Deputy U.S. Marshals rode down the trail to Younger's Bend. For years, this place had been a no-go zone, a sanctuary for fugitives where the law entered at its own peril. Now, they were in charge, picking through the life of the woman who had so often made fools of them. The investigation began, and the web of suspects was tangled and dark, spun from the threads of Belle's own life. Every person in her orbit had a potential motive. The first and most obvious suspect was a man named Edgar Watson. He was a tenant on Belle's land, a man with a shadowy past from Florida, rumored to be wanted for murder himself. They had argued bitterly. Belle wanted him gone, and Watson wasn't a man who liked being told what to do. It was a simple, logical motive, a dispute over land and money that ended in violence. But the simple answer isn't always the true one. Then there was her own husband, a Cherokee man named Jim July Starr. He was younger than Belle and was, at the time of her murder, facing his own trial for horse theft. Did they have a falling out? Was he driven by jealousy? Or, as some whispered, did he arrange the murder to silence her before she could testify in some secret deal with the law? He had an alibi, but in the murky world of Younger's Bend, an alibi was just another story. The silence that fell over the hills wasn't one of peace. It was a silence of fear. Belle's network of outlaws scattered, not knowing who among them might be next, or who might sell them out for a pardon. A reward was posted for information, but few dared to speak. The killer was still out there, and no one knew how far their reach extended. The hunt was on, not just for a murderer, but for the truth behind the final bloody act of the bandit queen's life. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but in the case of Belle Starr's murder, they seemed to grind through mud. The primary suspect, Edgar Watson, was finally brought to trial. You can just imagine the scene in the Fort Smith courtroom. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a spectacle. The room was packed with a tense mix of lawmen, curious townsfolk, and shadowed figures in the back rows, friends and enemies of the dead woman, all there to see how this final chapter would play out. The air itself felt heavy, thick with whispered theories and cold stares. Everyone had an opinion, and everyone was waiting for a conviction. The prosecution laid out its case. They painted a picture of a bitter dispute between a landlord and her troublesome tenant. They spoke of threats exchanged, of Watson's notorious temper, and of his presence near the scene of the crime. They presented him as a man with a motive, the means, and the opportunity. But their case was like a house built on sand. There was no murder weapon. There were no direct eyewitnesses to the shooting. The entire argument rested on bad blood and circumstantial evidence, a foundation that began to crumble under the slightest pressure. Watson, for his part, sat there with a cold confidence. He was no frightened farmer caught in the gears of the law. This was a man who understood the violence of the world. His defense lawyers didn't just deny his guilt. They threw the courtroom doors wide open to the chaos of Belle's life. They argued that putting only Edgar Watson on trial was absurd. Why not her husband, Jim July, who had his own legal troubles? Why not any of the dozens of spurned lovers, jilted partners, or vengeful victims Belle had created over the years? To have an enemy, they argued, was to be Belle Starr's acquaintance. And then, the darkest rumor of all, a chilling whisper that slithered through the courtroom, gave everyone pause. The story of Belle and her own son, Eddie. Their relationship was poison. He was a disappointment, and she was a harsh mother. The gossip was that just before her death, she had taken a whip to him for mistreating her favorite horse. Had the boy's resentment finally boiled over into an unspeakable act? Could he have pulled the trigger himself, or perhaps paid Watson to do it for him? It was a monstrous thought, but in the world Belle had built, it wasn't an impossible one. Faced with a weak case and a sea of reasonable doubt, the jury was trapped. They could condemn a man on suspicion, or they could let a potential killer walk free. They deliberated, and when they returned, the foreman's voice cut through the silence. "Not guilty." A shockwave went through the room. Edgar Watson, the man everyone was so sure had done it, stood up and walked out of the courtroom a free man. And so, the law of men had spoken. But was it justice? Or was it just a failure of a system that couldn't comprehend the complex, violent world of Younger's Bend? The court case was closed, but the murder remained unsolved. The killer had vanished back into the hills, becoming just another ghost in the bloody history of the territory. The truth, it seemed, was buried with the Bandit Queen. The murder of Belle Starr wasn't the end of the story. It was the explosion that scattered the pieces. Her kingdom, Younger's Bend, crumbled without its queen. The outlaws who had found sanctuary there drifted away, seeking new shadows to hide in. The land itself was eventually swallowed up by the relentless tide of settlement and progress. Today, what was once the most notorious hideout in the Indian Territory lies quiet and still, submerged beneath the placid waters of Lake Eufaula. A concrete historical marker stands on a nearby hill, a lone sentinel pointing toward the drowned land, the only official sign that this infamous chapter of the West ever happened here. The fates of those in her orbit were as tangled and often as tragic as her own. Edgar Watson, the acquitted suspect, moved on, but his reputation followed him. He eventually met a violent end himself, gunned down by a vigilante mob in Florida. Her last husband, Jim July Starr, died in a gunfight with lawmen not long after Belle's murder. Her son, Eddie Reed, who some whispered was the true killer, lived a troubled life, eventually becoming a deputy sheriff himself before being killed in a saloon brawl. It seems the violence that Belle had courted her whole life clung to those she left behind, an inescapable inheritance. But there is one final strange twist. Her daughter, Pearl, the one rumored to be Cole Younger's child, chose a different path of rebellion. She turned her back on the world of guns and stolen horses and moved to Fort Smith, where she opened a high-class brothel. In a way, she too became a queen, presiding over her own illicit kingdom, a world with its own codes and dangers, just a stone's throw from the courthouse where her mother's killer had been set free. The strongest echo of Belle Starr, however, is not in the ground, but in the story itself. After her death, the legend took on a life of its own. A journalist named Richard Fox penned a lurid book called Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, or the Female Jesse James. It was a work of pure fiction, filled with sensational tales of her leading bank robberies and stagecoach heists, things she never actually did. This book, and the countless dime novels that followed, created the image we think of today, the pistol-packing outlaw in a feathered hat. The myth completely consumed the woman. You can still visit her grave, tucked away in the woods not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. The original headstone, carved with a bell, a star, and a poignant poem, was chipped away to nothing by souvenir hunters over the decades. A new, protected monument stands in its place. And as you stand there, in the quiet of those Oklahoma hills, you realize the mountains do remember. They remember the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, the educated girl, the grieving sister, the cunning organizer, and the woman who gambled her life on a defiant dream of freedom and lost. So we return to the question that has hung in the air since those shotgun blasts first rang out. Who killed Belle Starr? The law of men never gave us a name. Was it the vengeful tenant, Edgar Watson? Was it one of her own family, a final, terrible betrayal? We will never know for sure. But maybe the real answer isn't a name. Maybe what killed Belle Starr was the violent, lawless world she had so carefully constructed around herself. In the end, the snake she had nurtured in the heart of Younger's Bend finally turned and bit its queen. Her story is a powerful reminder that the Civil War didn't truly end at Appomattox. It continued to rage in the hearts of people like Myra Shirley, leaving scars that festered into a deep and abiding hatred for the authority that had won. She was not a hero. She was not the cartoon villain of the penny press. She was a casualty, a woman whose fierce mountain pride, when poisoned by grief, became a force of self-destruction. She waged a 25-year war against a world she felt had wronged her, and in that war, there could only be one victor. Myra Maybelle Shirley was a woman of stark contradictions, the educated lady who could quote the classics and the ruthless godmother who ruled a den of thieves. She was born with the spirit of the mountains in her blood, proud, defiant, and unforgiving. But that spirit, when broken, forged a legend written in gunsmoke and blood. A girl who was meant to be a lady became the bandit queen, a cautionary tale that still echoes in the hills where she once rode. In the autumn of 1806, a stunning proclamation from President Thomas Jefferson sent a shockwave across the young United States. It warned of a conspiracy, a secret expedition of armed men forming on the western rivers with a purpose unfriendly to the peace of the Union. It called for the immediate arrest of the plot's ringleader, a man whose name was known in every household from the drawing rooms of Philadelphia to the log cabins of the frontier, former Vice President Aaron Burr. The news was unthinkable. This was a man who had stood just one heartbeat from the presidency, a hero of the revolution, a founder of the nation. Now he was a fugitive, accused of the ultimate crime, treason. What had happened? What dark ambition could drive a man of such stature to raise a private army in the Appalachian wilderness? Was he a patriot preparing for a secret war against Spain, or a would-be emperor plotting to shatter the fragile American Republic and carve out his own kingdom in the West? Today, we will become detectives of the past, sifting through the forgotten clues of this grand and shadowy plot to finally answer the question, who was the real Aaron Burr? To understand the tragedy that unfolded, you first have to understand the world that was at risk. Not just the lives of a few men, but the very soul of a young nation. In 1805, the United States was less a single unified country and more a fragile alliance between the settled, powerful East and the wild, restless West. The Appalachian Mountains were the great dividing line, and the people who lived in their shadow felt like a nation unto themselves. They were veterans paid in land they had to fight for, Scots-Irish settlers who bowed to no authority but their own, and pioneers who saw the federal government not as a protector, but as a distant collection of politicians who neither understood nor cared about their struggles. Their lifeline, the mighty Mississippi River, was choked off at its mouth by the Spanish, who held New Orleans. To them, the Union felt like a promise broken. At the heart of this volatile frontier, there was a literal paradise, a place that symbolized everything that stood to be lost. On an island in the Ohio River, A wealthy Irish aristocrat named Harman Blennerhassett had built a dream. Fleeing scandal in Europe, he and his brilliant wife, Margaret, had constructed a stunning white mansion, a beacon of European culture in the American wilderness. It was filled with telescopes, lavish libraries, and fine art. From its portico, one could hear music and scientific debate instead of the cry of the panther. Blennerhassett was a dreamer, a romantic, a man more at home with a chemistry experiment than a rifle. He sought a life of refined intellectual peace, far from the intrigues of the old world. His wife, Margaret, was his equal in every way, a poet, an accomplished horsewoman, and a gracious host who made their island a legendary oasis of hospitality. They had 2 young sons and a fortune they believed was secure. Their world was one of beauty, science, and domestic tranquility, an idyllic existence carved right out of the rugged frontier. They were not the only ones with a stake in the future. All along the river valleys, thousands of families had gambled everything on this new land. They had cleared the forests, fought off disease, and planted their hopes in the rich, dark soil. Their lives were hard, their dreams simple: to own their land, to provide for their children, and to have a say in their own destiny. They were a proud, tough, and deeply dissatisfied people, their hearts filled with a simmering resentment against the East and a burning hunger for the opportunities they believed lay just beyond the horizon. This, then, was the world that existed before the serpent entered the garden. A fragile nation, a perfect island paradise, and a populace of hardy frontiersmen, all vulnerable in their own ways. They were a collection of dreamers, idealists, and fighters, unknowingly waiting for a charismatic leader to ignite their passions and lead them toward a new destiny or toward their own destruction. The crime, in this case, was not discovered with a single gunshot or a body in a ravine. It was discovered in pieces, a slow dawning horror that spread through the Appalachian territories like a fever. The crime scene was the entire Ohio River Valley, and the clues were not stains of blood, but the sounds of hammers and the whispers of restless men. The epicenter of it all was Harman Blennerhassett's idyllic island. The once peaceful estate had been transformed. The music and philosophical debates were replaced by the ring of blacksmiths' anvils and the thud of axes. Locals paddling past the island in their skiffs saw things that made no sense. A fleet of 15 massive keelboats was being constructed, far more than any group of simple settlers would need. Harman Blennerhassett, the gentle scholar, had turned the grand halls of his mansion into a workshop, using his fireplaces to kiln dry the wood for the boats. Huge quantities of supplies were being stockpiled: barrels of pork, sacks of flour, and casks of whiskey, enough to sustain an army, not a handful of families heading to a new farm. The most unsettling clues were the men themselves. Young, rootless, and ambitious men from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky began to gather on the island. They weren't farmers. They carried new rifles and spoke not of planting seasons, but of adventure and glory. When questioned, they were evasive, offering a sly grin and a vague promise of riches to be won in the South. The story changed depending on who was telling it. Some said they were off to settle the Bastrop Tract, a massive land grant in Texas. Others winked and spoke of a secret government mission to fight the Spanish. The scene spoke of a grand conspiracy unfolding in plain sight, yet its true purpose remained maddeningly obscure. Was this an elaborate land speculation, as Burr publicly claimed? Or was it the secret mobilization of a patriot army waiting for the president's signal to march on Spanish territory? Or was it something far darker, the birth of a rebel force preparing to turn its guns on its own country? The wilderness offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions that grew louder with every plank nailed into place. At the center of this storm of rumor and preparation stood one man, the obvious and immediate suspect: Aaron Burr. This was not some backwoods rabble-rouser. This was a political giant, a fallen angel of the Republic. By 1805, Burr was a political ghost, a man whose career had been immolated in the fires of scandal. As vice president, he had been sidelined and distrusted by Thomas Jefferson. Then came the final, fatal blow, his duel with Alexander Hamilton. By killing his great rival, Burr had made himself a pariah in the East, a man reviled in the very halls of power he had once commanded. His motive, whispered from the taverns of Pittsburgh to the halls of Congress, was not simple greed, but something far more potent, a burning desire for revenge. This entire Western enterprise was seen as a grand and audacious act of personal vengeance against the nation and the man who had cast him out. Burr felt betrayed by the American political system, and his ambition was to build a new empire in the West, so powerful and glorious that it would dwarf the United States. He would show Jefferson, he would show all of them, what a mistake they had made. To the people in the East, his actions weren't about settling land. They were about settling a score. The initial evidence was Burr himself, and the godlike manner in which he traveled through the wilderness. He journeyed down the Ohio not in a humble canoe, but on a magnificent 60-foot barge, a floating mansion complete with a dining hall and wine cellar. Imagine the spectacle, this vessel of Eastern luxury gliding past the rough log cabins of the frontier. It was a statement of power and intent, the procession of a king, not the humble transport of a pioneer. Whispers followed him everywhere, born of his almost hypnotic personal charm. Witnesses described a man with piercing dark eyes who could hold a room captive with his words. He didn't just ask for support, he seduced men into his vision. He made every farmer, every militia captain, every wealthy planter feel as though they were the single most important person to the success of his grand and secret enterprise. The sheer number of influential men who flocked to his banner was damning evidence in itself. From the moment his grand barge appeared on the river, there was no doubt who the leader was. Every rifle purchased, every boat built, every secret oath sworn in the dead of night pointed directly back to one man, the disgraced Vice President, Aaron Burr. But as grand as Burr's ambition was, he wasn't acting alone. He couldn't be. To seize New Orleans and control the West, he needed more than a few dozen frontiersmen in keelboats. He needed a military man on the inside, a powerful ally who could deliver the U.S. Army itself into his hands. He had such a partner, a man whose position made the entire scheme seem not just possible, but destined for success. General James Wilkinson, the commanding general of the entire United States Army and the governor of the Louisiana Territory. He was Burr's most trusted confidant, his co-conspirator, the sword that would carve out their new empire. And here, my friends, is where the story twists from a simple tale of ambition into a shadowy labyrinth of deceit. For what no one in Burr's inner circle knew, what the frontiersmen flocking to his banner could never have imagined, was that General Wilkinson, the highest-ranking soldier in the United States, was living a lie. For years, he had been a secret agent on the payroll of the Spanish government, known to his handlers only as Agent 13. Wilkinson's loyalty was not to Aaron Burr, nor was it to President Jefferson. His true master was himself, and his motive was a toxic cocktail of greed and a desperate instinct for self-preservation. He was playing the most dangerous game imaginable, promising support to Burr's conspiracy while feeding information to his Spanish masters, all while maintaining his position as America's top general. With this horrifying truth in mind, all of Wilkinson's actions snap into a darker focus. His letters to Burr, filled with encouragement and bold promises of delivering New Orleans, were not the communications of a loyal partner. They were the calculated words of a master manipulator, luring Burr deeper and deeper into the trap. He fanned the flames of Burr's ambition, assuring him that the army was ready, that the Creole population of New Orleans would welcome him as a liberator. Each promise was another thread in the web he was weaving around his supposed friend. His apparent support was pure theater, a performance for an audience of one. Re-examined, every action reeks of a darker truth. Wilkinson was not helping Burr build an empire, he was helping him build a gallows. He waited, letting Burr invest his money, his reputation, and the lives of his followers. He let the conspiracy grow just large enough to be a credible threat, all the while holding an axe over its neck, positioning himself to be the hero who would eventually save the very nation he was helping to endanger. The greatest threat to Aaron Burr wasn't the president in Washington, but the trusted brother-in-arms standing right beside him. But the conspiracy wasn't just a drama between American titans. The Appalachian frontier was not some isolated stage. It was the explosive friction point between competing empires, a grand chessboard where the players were not just ambitious individuals, but entire nations. Beyond the personal vendettas and internal betrayals, there was a third looming force at play, the shadowy hand of foreign powers, particularly Great Britain and Spain. They were the external threat, the silent partners whose interests stood to be served by chaos on the American frontier. Their motives were as cold and impersonal as they were powerful. Great Britain, still stinging from its defeat in the Revolution, saw in Burr's plan a golden opportunity to fracture and weaken its upstart rival. A new, independent Western republic, hostile to the United States and friendly to the Crown, would be a strategic masterstroke. It would halt American expansion and give Britain effective control over the Mississippi River and the heart of the continent. The British minister in Washington, Anthony Merry, listened with great interest to Burr's proposals, seeing a chance to undo the results of the war. Spain, on the other hand, was a crumbling empire motivated by pure fear. They looked at the aggressive, land-hungry American frontiersmen pouring over the Appalachians and saw an existential threat to their most valuable colonial possession, silver-rich Mexico. For the Spanish, Burr's plot was both a terrifying danger and a potential solution. A successful invasion would be a catastrophe, but a civil war that turned Americans against each other could keep them occupied for decades, protecting the Spanish border through mutual destruction. This foreign meddling created a poisonous paranoia that seeped into every settlement along the river. Who could be trusted? Locals spoke of well-dressed strangers with European accents appearing in frontier taverns, men with heavy coin purses and too many questions. Rumors spread that the incredible sums of money funding Burr's expedition were not coming from his own ruined fortune, but from the coffers of a foreign king. This wasn't just a domestic rebellion anymore. It was an international intrigue, and the hardy folk of Appalachia were being courted, manipulated, and used as pawns in a game whose rules they didn't understand, by forces whose ultimate loyalty was to a distant throne. The initial pursuit of Aaron Burr was not a chase through the mountains, but a maddening hunt through a wilderness of lies. Burr, a master of political intrigue, had constructed a labyrinth of false trails and red herrings so brilliant that it paralyzed his enemies and confused his friends. The investigation, led from a distance by a deeply worried President Jefferson, repeatedly crashed against the wall of Burr's plausible deniability. The most powerful of these false trails was the public and seemingly legitimate one, the settlement of the Bastrop Tract. Burr had purchased a massive disputed land claim on the Ouachita River in what is now Louisiana. To the world, he was simply the leader of a land company, gathering brave pioneers to build a new life in the West. It was the perfect cover. Every boat built, every barrel of flour purchased, every man recruited could be explained away as a necessary preparation for this grand, legal settlement. When local officials came snooping, they were shown land deeds and contracts. Burr would greet them with the disarming charm of a respectable businessman, asking, "Gentlemen, is it now a crime in this republic to seek one's fortune?" The lead would go cold. For those who weren't satisfied by the simple story of a land venture, Burr had a more intoxicating bait, the patriot's cloak. He would take a man like Andrew Jackson aside and in a low, confidential tone hint that this entire expedition was a secret plan, tacitly approved by the administration in Washington. War with Spain was imminent, he'd suggest, and his force of hardy frontiersmen was meant to be the vanguard of the American army, ready to seize Texas or even Mexico the moment hostilities began. This masterstroke of misdirection turned potential accusers into enthusiastic allies. How could you arrest a man who was carrying out the president's secret orders? Back in Washington, Thomas Jefferson was wrestling with shadows. The reports that reached him were a maddening torrent of contradictions. One letter would paint Burr as a traitorous madman, the next as a misunderstood patriot. The vastness of the Appalachian frontier swallowed the truth. Messengers took weeks to travel, and by the time Jefferson could act on a piece of intelligence, the situation on the ground had already changed. He dispatched agents to the Ohio, but they too became lost in the fog of rumor. The investigation was dying a death of 1,000 dead ends. The posse would gather, ready to act on a damning rumor, only to find Burr had already sailed downriver, leaving behind a camp of men who swore they were just simple farmers. Promising leads evaporated in the Appalachian mist. This growing frustration in Washington and the rising confusion on the frontier was exactly what Burr intended. His campaign of misdirection was his greatest weapon, allowing his conspiracy to grow in plain sight, shielded by a brilliant wilderness of lies. President Jefferson's agents quickly discovered they were not just fighting against Aaron Burr, they were fighting against the entire culture of the Appalachian frontier. When they arrived in the bustling river towns and isolated homesteads to ask questions, they were met with a wall of silence, as thick and impenetrable as the mountain laurel. Doors were politely shut in their faces. Men in taverns would suddenly fall quiet, turning to stare into their mugs of ale. Neighbors who saw everything suddenly saw nothing. Those who heard the feverish preparations heard only the wind in the trees. You see, this was not the silence of simple ignorance. It was a deliberate collective act of defiance born from a deep and abiding distrust of the federal government. To these people, the men from Washington were the outsiders, the tax collectors, the agents of Eastern bankers who held their land titles. Aaron Burr, by contrast, was one of them. He was a war hero, a man of action, an enemy of the very Eastern elite they despised. Asking a Kentucky farmer to betray Aaron Burr to a federal agent was like asking him to side with the fox against his own hounds. It went against the grain of his very soul. This silence was also rooted in a shared dream. Burr wasn't just selling a conspiracy, he was selling hope. His vision of a Western empire, of conquering the riches of Mexico, became their vision. Their sons and brothers were the young men signing up for the expedition. Their crops were feeding the recruits, their whiskey filling the barrels on the boats. The entire region was complicit, bound together by a web of kinship, commerce, and a mutual gamble on a glorious future. To speak against Burr was to speak against their own community, against their own aspirations, and against the prospect of a better life that felt, for the first time, within their grasp. The psychological toll on anyone who considered breaking the code was immense. A man who voiced his doubts about Burr at the local store might find himself ostracized, his credit suddenly no good. A ferryman who reported the movement of armed men might find his boat mysteriously cut adrift in the night. There was no need for overt threats. The fear of retribution was a cold, unspoken understanding. In a land where a man's survival depended on his neighbors, isolation was a death sentence. And so, the people saw nothing, heard nothing, and said nothing, creating a perfect, silent incubator where treason could grow in the open air. For months, the conspiracy had been protected by Burr's masterful deceptions and the frontier's code of silence. But the turning point, the clue that finally broke the case wide open, did not come from a dusty attic or a deathbed confession. It came in a sealed dispatch, carried by military courier across hundreds of miles of wilderness, penned by the hand of the conspiracy's most important architect. The clue was a letter, and the man who wrote it was General James Wilkinson. Stationed in Louisiana, Far from the prying eyes of the East, Wilkinson played his double game as long as he could. But by the late autumn of 1806, he realized the plot was faltering. The expected money from Britain hadn't arrived, recruitment was slower than hoped, and President Jefferson was growing more suspicious by the day. Wilkinson saw that the ship was sinking, and he decided his best move was not just to jump, but to set the entire vessel on fire and claim the reward for sounding the alarm. He chose a side, and it was his own. The letter that arrived on President Jefferson's desk was a masterpiece of calculated treachery. To save himself, Wilkinson had to portray Burr as the greatest villain the Republic had ever known, and himself as the loyal soldier who had uncovered the plot. He laid out the conspiracy in the most terrifying terms imaginable. He spoke of a plan to seize New Orleans, rob the banks, incite a civil war, and create a Western empire with Burr on the throne. He painted Burr not as a mere adventurer, but as an American Napoleon, a devil whose ambition threatened the very existence of the United States. This letter was the forgotten clue that had been hiding in plain sight all along, the word of a traitor. For Jefferson, it was the moment of horrifying clarity. The fog of rumor was instantly burned away. The contradictory reports, the whispers, the vague warnings, they were all replaced by this one damning account from the highest-ranking general in the army. The labyrinth of lies that Burr had so carefully constructed collapsed in an instant. The letter changed everything. There was no more room for doubt, no more need for cautious investigation. The threat was real, it was imminent, and its full, treasonous scope was finally laid bare. A renewed and terrible urgency seized the capital. The time for waiting was over. The time for action was now. The moment Jefferson broke the seal on that letter, the game was over, and the manhunt was about to begin. With Wilkinson's damning letter in hand, President Thomas Jefferson acted. He issued a presidential proclamation that swept down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers like a flood, a single sheet of paper that tore away the web of lies and unmasked Aaron Burr before the entire nation. The proclamation ordered all civil and military officers to seize the illegal expedition, its boats, its supplies, and its leader. There was no more ambiguity, no more talk of secret government plans or peaceful settlement. The President of the United States had officially branded Aaron Burr a traitor. The news shattered the conspiracy. For the young men gathered on Blennerhassett Island and in camps along the river, the unmasking was a moment of brutal awakening. The dream of Mexican silver and grand adventure evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark reality of treason. They weren't patriots in waiting. They were outlaws, fugitives in their own country. The cause they had pledged their lives to was revealed as a criminal enterprise. And what was the true plot? The one hidden beneath all the layers of deceit. The forgotten clues, the letters between the conspirators, and Wilkinson's own self-serving confession finally revealed the chilling truth. Burr's plan was a masterpiece of flexible ambition. The first step was to lead his army of frontiersmen to New Orleans. He would seize the city, its federal arsenal, and its treasury. From there, his options would open up. If the moment was right, he would persuade the western states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, to secede from the Union and form a new Western empire with himself as its head. If secession proved difficult, he would use the captured funds and weapons to launch his own private invasion of Spanish Mexico, conquering its silver mines and crowning himself Emperor Aaron I. His motive was a volcanic mixture of personal revenge and grandiose destiny. Scorned by the nation he had helped to build, he sought to create a new one in his own image, a vigorous, martial empire free from the constraints of Jeffersonian democracy. He saw himself not as a traitor, but as a new Napoleon, a man of action destined to forge a continent. But as Burr was unmasked as a traitor to his country, a second, more profound unmasking was taking place in the shadows of history. The man who brought him down, General James Wilkinson, was revealed to be a traitor of a different order. He was a man who betrayed everyone. He betrayed Spain by plotting with Burr. He betrayed Burr by exposing him to Jefferson. And he betrayed the United States by serving as a paid foreign agent while commanding its armies. The Great Burr Conspiracy was not ultimately foiled by loyal patriots. It was cannibalized from within, brought down by the successful treachery of its second-in-command, a man whose only motive was his own survival and profit. This was the final, ugly truth. The plot to create a new empire was destroyed by an even deeper, more personal betrayal. The president's words fell upon the frontier not like rain, but like shards of ice. The proclamation, spreading from rider to rider, shattered the grand conspiracy in 1,000 pieces. On Blennerhassett Island, the heart of the enterprise, the dream died in a single night of chaos. The Virginia militia descended not upon a disciplined military camp, but upon a confused and terrified group of men who now understood they had been betrayed. With Burr and Blennerhassett already downriver, the abandoned recruits, their hopes of glory and riches turned to ash, unleashed their fury on the paradise that had lured them in. Through the eyes of Margaret Blennerhassett, who had been left behind, paradise was lost in a symphony of destruction. She didn't see a battle, she heard the end of a world. She heard the splintering crash of fine cherrywood as elegant furniture was broken apart. The air filled with the sharp, sickening sound of shattering Venetian glass and the reek of whiskey spilled on priceless Persian rugs. She heard the drunken shouts of men she had once fed at her own table, their voices no longer filled with hope, but with a bitter, aimless rage. In the main hall, dark, ragged holes began to appear in the fine linen draperies, the silent witnesses of a dream being shot to pieces. Forced to flee with her children into the freezing December night, her only transport was an open riverboat. As it was pushed out into the icy current, she looked back at her magnificent home, its windows blazing with light, not from a joyous party, but from the fires set within by the rampaging men. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing silence as her home, her dream, and her future were consumed by the darkness. Miles downriver, Aaron Burr himself heard the news of Wilkinson's betrayal and Jefferson's proclamation. The unmasking was absolute. In an instant, his grand design crumbled. The man who dreamed of an emperor's throne was now forced into the disguise of a common boatman, hoping to slip through the net that was closing around him. He became a fugitive, his flight a desperate scramble toward the Spanish territory in Florida. The end came not in a blaze of glory on a battlefield, but in a muddy swamp in the backwoods of what is now Alabama. He was not cornered in a heroic last stand. He was simply recognized by his aristocratic bearing and his fine, elegant boots, mired in the filth. The would-be emperor was captured without a single shot being fired. The Grand Western Army was no more. The boats were impounded, the men scattered to the winds, and the beautiful mansion on the island stood silent and ravaged, a monument to a spectacular failure. The conspiracy was over, ending not with a bang, but with the hollow echo of a dream breaking. Aaron Burr was brought to Richmond, Virginia, to stand trial for treason, and what followed was not merely a legal proceeding, but a political war waged in a courtroom. It was a spectacle that gripped the entire nation. In one corner stood President Thomas Jefferson, consumed with a burning, almost personal need to see his old rival hanged. In the other corner sat the judge, the formidable Chief Justice John Marshall, a man who was not only Jefferson's political enemy, but also his cousin. And at the center of it all was Aaron Burr, who, far from being a broken-down prisoner, acted as his own lead counsel, his brilliant legal mind as sharp and dangerous as ever. The atmosphere in Richmond was electric. The city swelled with crowds, a chaotic mix of statesmen, lawyers, frontiersmen who had come to testify, and curious onlookers eager for a glimpse of the great traitor. The prosecution, backed by the full power of the presidency, presented a mountain of evidence detailing Burr's grand ambitions and military preparations. Jefferson himself from Washington attempted to micromanage the case, convinced that the very survival of the Republic depended on a guilty verdict. But Chief Justice Marshall saw the trial through a different lens. He saw the danger not just from Burr's ambition, but from a president willing to bend the law to destroy a political foe. Marshall stood firm on a strict, narrow definition of treason as laid out in the Constitution itself. He instructed the jury that to be guilty of treason, a person must commit an overt act of war against the United States. Simply plotting to do so, gathering men, or speaking of empire was not enough. The prosecution had to prove that Burr's army had actually levied war, which of course it never had. There had been no battle, no shots fired at American troops. The president's fury was immense, but the Chief Justice would not yield. Trapped by this strict constitutional standard, the prosecution's case collapsed. They could prove intent, they could prove conspiracy, but they could not prove an overt act of war. After all the drama, all the testimony, and all the political maneuvering, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. Aaron Burr, the man who dreamed of empire and set the entire West ablaze, walked out of the courtroom a free man. The verdict was a stunning legal victory, but a profound moral failure in the eyes of many. Jefferson was enraged, the public was bewildered, and the frontiersmen who had followed Burr were left ruined and betrayed. While legally innocent of treason, Burr was found guilty in the court of public opinion. He was a free man, but his name was forever destroyed, his honor gone. The verdict, a landmark in American law, remains controversial to this day. A verdict that still sparks arguments in these hills about whether justice was truly served, or if the greatest traitor of them all simply got away with it. The storm of the Burr conspiracy had passed, but the wreckage was strewn across a generation. Though acquitted, Aaron Burr was a ruined man. He became a living ghost, a specter of his former self, ostracized from the country he had once helped to lead. He spent years in self-imposed exile in Europe, still scheming, still trying to find a foreign monarch to back his imperial dreams, but he was a man without a country and without credibility. He eventually returned to America and spent his final decades as an obscure lawyer in New York City, haunted by the shadows of what might have been. The man who dreamed of an emperor's throne died in relative poverty, his name forever synonymous not with founder, but with traitor. For Harmon and Margaret Blennerhassett, the dream had become a permanent nightmare. Their island paradise was a memory, their mansion a looted shell, their fortune gone. Harmon was arrested and spent months in a Richmond prison before the charges were dropped in the wake of Burr's acquittal. But his freedom was a hollow victory. Hounded by debt and disgrace, the couple wandered for years, from Mississippi to Canada to the Caribbean, trying to rebuild their lives, but they never recovered. Harmon died in poverty, and Margaret's final years were spent petitioning a Congress that had long forgotten her for some compensation for their ruined home. The idyllic life they had built in the wilderness was the first and most tragic casualty of Burr's ambition. But not everyone was destroyed. In Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, the fiery general who had been so taken with Burr, emerged from the scandal not only unscathed, but strengthened. He had been cautious, demanding proof that Burr's plans were sanctioned by the government. When that proof never came, and Wilkinson's betrayal was revealed, Jackson swiftly and publicly distanced himself from the plot, positioning himself as a loyal patriot who had been misled. The affair taught him a valuable lesson in political survival and reinforced his reputation as a shrewd and decisive leader. His brush with Burr's treason did nothing to slow his own meteoric rise to power. And the arch-traitor himself, General James Wilkinson, the man who had betrayed Spain, Burr, and the United States, he was never held to account. Despite a congressional investigation that uncovered his long history as a Spanish spy, he was exonerated, his web of lies and influence proving too thick to penetrate. He retained his command, continued his career, and died years later, the ultimate survivor of the web of lies he himself had spun. His fate was perhaps the story's bitterest lesson, that in the murky world of power, the greatest crimes are sometimes the ones that go unpunished. Even now, more than 2 centuries later, the traces of this grand and failed dream have not vanished from the land. The conspiracy is not just a story in a history book, it is a scar left on the map of Appalachia, a memory etched into the landscape itself. If you travel today to a small island in the Ohio River near Parkersburg, West Virginia, you can step right into the heart of the story. Blennerhassett Island is now a state park. The magnificent Palladian mansion, destroyed by fire and the passage of time, has been meticulously reconstructed, its white columns rising once more from the wilderness. You can walk through its halls and stand on its portico, looking out at the same river that once carried Burr's ambitions, and it is almost impossible not to feel the ghosts of that hopeful, tragic autumn. But the island is not the only place the memory lives on. It lingers in the old stories, in the local folklore of the river valley. For generations after Burr fled, treasure hunters would search the caves and hollows along the Ohio. They were looking for Burr's lost treasure, chests of Spanish silver and gold that legend says he was forced to bury when he became a fugitive. No great treasure was ever found, of course, but the myth itself is a powerful echo of the original promise that lured men to his banner. The dream of unimaginable wealth, a shortcut to a better life, buried just beneath the Appalachian soil. The land itself has not forgotten. The Ohio River, the great artery of the conspiracy, still flows past the same towns, Marietta, Parkersburg, Cincinnati, that once buzzed with whispers of the coming expedition. Standing on its banks today, watching the slow-moving barges, it is easy to imagine the sight of Burr's keelboats filled with armed men slipping past in the pre-dawn mist on their way toward a destiny they could not yet see. The river remembers. It was the silent witness to the entire affair, from the first nail hammered into a boat to the final desperate flight of its leader. And so, the story endures, passed down not in textbooks, but in the heart of the region itself. It has become a part of the Appalachian identity, a cautionary tale about a man of great ambition who tried to harness the restless spirit of the frontier for his own glory. The world might forget the details of the Burr conspiracy, but the mountains, the rivers, and the people who live in their shadow hold on to these memories. They remember the charismatic devil who came down the river, the paradise that was lost, and the grand dream of a Western empire that almost tore the nation apart before it was ever truly whole. And so, we come back to the question that started our journey into the shadows of the past. Was Aaron Burr a misunderstood patriot, or was he a would-be emperor? The truth, as is so often the case in these mountains, is far more complicated. Burr was a mirror. To men like Andrew Jackson, he reflected their own patriotic desire to fight the Spanish. To the dreamer Harmon Blennerhassett, he reflected a vision of an enlightened new society. And to the restless young men of the frontier, he reflected their own hunger for glory and wealth. The terrible genius of Aaron Burr was his ability to be all of these things at once, a man whose true plan was so cloaked in ambiguity that it allowed everyone to see in it the fulfillment of their own deepest desires. But this is a story not just of one man's ambition. It is a timeless lesson on the fragility of a nation. The Burr conspiracy laid bare the deep and dangerous cracks in the foundation of the young American Republic. It showed how easily the souls of a proud and forgotten people can be stirred by a charismatic leader who speaks to their grievances. The resentments of the Appalachian settlers were real, their feeling of abandonment was justified, and their discontent created a powder keg that Burr, for a moment, held the match to. This story serves as a stark and chilling warning that a union is not held together by laws and documents alone, but by a shared sense of purpose and trust. When that trust is broken, when a part of the nation feels its voice is not heard, the door is opened for men like Aaron Burr. It is a tale of how personal vendetta can masquerade as political destiny, and how the dream of a more perfect union can so nearly be shattered by the dream of a private empire. And now, my friends, you know the story of the phantom empire that rose and fell on these western waters, or at least as much of it as the river is willing to give up. When the gun smoke cleared over the Tugfork River, one Hatfield lay dead on the ferry landing, put there by another. The killer wasn't some long-hated McCoy. He was the law itself, Sheriff Bud Hatfield, and the man bleeding out in the dirt was his own cousin. This single act raises a chilling question that echoes through the hollows to this day. How does a man forged in the fires of the Hatfield feud, a clan that valued blood above all else, bring himself to kill his own family for a tin star? The newspapers of the day called it justice. But those who lived in the shadows of the mountains whispered a different story, a story of a kinslayer, a man who made a deal with the devil, a traitor who sold his soul. Today, we will separate the facts from the folklore to find the truth behind the most feared and complicated lawman in Appalachian history. To understand the man, you have to understand the silence that fell after the storm. By the turn of the 20th century, the great Hatfield-McCoy feud was over. The shooting had mostly stopped. The famous raids were now just stories told to wide-eyed children. But the peace was a fragile, wounded thing. It was a land of long memories and short tempers, where a man's last name was more important than any law written in a book. The Tugfork Valley was a world unto itself, a labyrinth of creeks and hollows where families lived by codes carved into their very bones over generations. Justice wasn't found in a courthouse. It was settled in a cornfield, on a riverbank, or at the dark end of a lonely mountain path. In this world of simmering grudges lived William Anderson Hatfield, known to all as Bud. He was not a patriarch like his famous cousin, Devil Anse. He was a younger man, molded by the feud's final bloody years. He had seen the cost of hot-blooded pride firsthand. While his kin were known for their booming laughs and explosive tempers, Bud was different. He was quiet, watchful. He moved through the woods not like a man, but like a shadow, his eyes missing nothing. He didn't boast of his skill with a pistol. He simply practiced, hour after hour, until the Colt revolver felt like an extension of his own hand. He learned the mountains as a hunter, but he wasn't just tracking deer. He was learning how men think when they're being hunted, where they hide when they're scared, and the fatal mistakes they make when they believe they're safe. He was absorbing the brutal lessons of the feud, not as a brawler, but as a student of violence. He was a weapon being forged in the quiet aftermath of a war, waiting for a purpose. His world was one of clan loyalty, where the only thing that mattered was protecting your own, no matter the cost. But a new sound was beginning to echo through the mountains, a sound louder than a rifle shot. It was the chugging of steam engines and the grinding of machinery. Coal companies with their fat checkbooks and their armies of private detectives from agencies like Baldwin Felts were pushing their way into the hills. They saw the mountains not as a home, but as a treasure chest to be cracked open. They brought with them a new kind of law, corporate law, and they had no patience for the old ways of the clans. The world that had created Bud Hatfield was about to be devoured, and he would soon have to make a choice that no Hatfield had ever faced. The conflict that would define Bud Hatfield's life didn't begin with a single gunshot. Its seeds were planted generations before, deep in the rocky Appalachian soil. The Hatfields, like many of the Scots-Irish families who first dared to cross the mountains, carved a kingdom for themselves, not with a pen and a deed, but with an axe and a long rifle. This land wasn't just property. It was their lifeblood, their fortress, and their identity. They owed allegiance to no distant government. They were kings of their own hollows, and they held their land with a fierce, possessive grip that outsiders could never understand. The deepest scar on this landscape was the Civil War. While the nation tore itself apart, the borderlands between West Virginia and Kentucky became a brutal theater of guerrilla warfare. The Hatfields were fiercely Confederate, seeing the Union as an invading force trying to impose its will upon them. Devil Anse himself led a band of irregulars, the Logan Wildcats, who fought a vicious war in the hills long after the main armies had gone home. They weren't just fighting for a political cause, they were fighting for their own sovereignty against any and all outside control. This deep-seated division bled directly into the Hatfield-McCoy feud. At its heart, it was a continuation of the war on a more personal scale, with the largely Confederate Hatfields pitted against the largely Unionist McCoys. The conflict was fueled by old loyalties and betrayals that the rest of the country was trying to forget. For these families, the war never ended. It simply smoldered under the surface, waiting for any spark, a stolen pig, a forbidden romance, to erupt into a full-blown inferno. In this world, a family name was everything. It was a heavy cloak of obligation and pride worn from birth. And to be a Hatfield meant you lived by an unwritten, unbreakable code. It meant you stood by your kin, right or wrong. It meant you settled your own scores, answered insults with your fists or your gun, and never backed down from a fight. Above all, it meant you never, ever turned to an outside lawman for justice, and you certainly never became one. The law was the enemy, the outsider, the threat to the clan's power. This was the legacy Bud Hatfield was born into, a legacy of fierce independence, deep suspicion, and a sworn duty to put blood before all else. The end of the feud didn't bring unity. It left a vacuum. With no common enemy to fight, the old clans began to turn on themselves. The Tugfork Valley became a tangled web of personal slights and simmering resentments. The supporting cast wasn't just Hatfield and McCoy anymore. It was the Hatfields who sold timber rights to the coal companies versus the Hatfields who refused. It was the families who wanted schools and roads versus the families who saw every change as an invasion. It was a community teetering on a knife's edge where everyone was watching everyone else, waiting for the first sign of weakness or betrayal. At the center of the old guard's resistance was Bud's own cousin, another Elias Hatfield, but this one went by a different name, Bad Lias. He was everything the old Hatfields were supposed to be, wild, violent, and utterly contemptuous of any law but his own. He drank, he brawled, and he took what he wanted. While Devil Anse was growing old and making calculated deals with the coal barons, Bad Lias was a living, breathing reminder of the clan's lawless past. He was a festering wound, a source of both pride and shame for the family, and his violent exploits kept the old animosities burning bright. The air itself grew thick with gossip. On the porch of the general store, men would speak in low tones about which Hatfield was seen talking to a Baldwin Felts man. Women would whisper over their washboards, speculating on who was behind a mysterious fire that burned a small logging operation. The McCoys and their allies, though quiet, were watching with hungry eyes. They saw the cracks forming in the great Hatfield dynasty and knew that a house divided against itself could not stand. Every fistfight, every land dispute, every drunken threat was fuel for a fire that had never truly been extinguished. This was a world where suspicion was a survival tool. A friendly wave from a man whose grandfather fought for the Union might be a genuine greeting, or it might be a trick to get a better look at the rifle you were carrying. A business deal gone sour wasn't a civil matter. It was a mortal insult that could lead to an ambush on a lonely stretch of road. It was a poison that seeped into the wells, turning neighbor against neighbor and cousin against cousin. The community wasn't healing. It was rotting from the inside out with paranoia and fear. And into this poisonous air, a new rumor began to spread, one more unbelievable than all the others. That Bud Hatfield, the quiet one, the dead shot, was thinking of doing the unthinkable. In the months before Bud Hatfield pinned on his badge, the old folks said the mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath. The air went still and heavy, the way it does before a lightning strike tears the sky open. A hoot owl, that feathered messenger of death, was heard crying in broad daylight near the Hatfield family graveyard. Men hunting deep in the woods came back with stories of feeling unseen eyes on their backs, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the bears or panthers that roamed the hills. The very land seemed to be sending a warning, whispering through the rustling leaves that the old world was dying and its ghost would not go peacefully. The human omen was far less subtle. Strangers began appearing in the hollows, men with clean hands and cold eyes, carrying surveyors' transits and leather briefcases full of contracts. They were the agents of the coal and timber companies, and they moved with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. They spoke of progress and prosperity, but their eyes measured the ancient trees in board feet and sized up the family homesteads by the tons of coal that lay beneath them. Their presence was a constant, grating reminder that the outside world was no longer content to leave the mountains alone. They were a walking, talking prophecy of a new kind of war, one fought not with rifles over family honor, but with lawyers and hired guns over mineral rights. Bud Hatfield, a man who read the woods better than any book, felt this change in his gut. It was a coiled tightness in the air, a new kind of fear in the eyes of his neighbors. He saw men who had once been proud and defiant, now speaking in hushed tones, worried about losing the very land their grandfathers had bled for. He saw the easy smiles of the company men and recognized the look of a predator sizing up its prey. He felt a deep, chilling premonition that the old Hatfield code of settling their own problems and protecting their own kin was no longer enough. It was a code designed for fighting other mountain men, not for fighting a corporation with limitless money and its own private army. Something terrible was coming, and Bud knew, with the certainty of a hunter sensing a shift in the wind, that he was standing directly in its path. The law in Logan County had become a ghost. It haunted the courthouse, but it held no power in the hollows. The chaos that Bud Hatfield had foreseen was no longer a distant storm. It was a flood. Drunken brawls turned into shootouts in broad daylight. Payrolls for the coal mines were robbed on the open road. Witnesses to crimes would suddenly lose their memory, their silence bought by a quiet threat delivered on their doorstep in the dead of night. The old system of clan justice was crumbling, and the new corporate law of the Baldwin Felts agents was nothing more than organized brutality, serving only the interests of the coal barons. The county was bleeding, and there was no one to stop it. It was in this desperate atmosphere that the county officials made their move. They needed a man who could not be intimidated, who knew the mountains and the mindset of the men who haunted them. They needed a man who was feared more than the outlaws themselves. And so, they came to the one man who fit that description perfectly. They came to Bud Hatfield. The offer was laid on the table, a deputy's badge. It wasn't a job offer, it was a plea. They weren't asking him to be a peacekeeper. They were asking him to be a hunter, a one-man army who could walk into the darkest hollows and drag the violence out into the light. For Bud, this was the moment the world stopped. To accept the badge was to turn his back on everything he had ever known. It was a declaration that the code of the Hatfields, the sacred bond of blood, was no longer his law. He was choosing the law of strangers over the blood of his grandfather. He looked at the chaos around him, at men like his cousin Bad Lears, who were becoming rabid dogs, and at the cold-eyed company thugs who were no better. He saw two paths leading to the same ruin, and in that moment he chose a third. With a steady hand, he reached out and took the small piece of tin. He pinned it to his chest. The word spread through the hollows like a pestilence. A Hatfield was the law. To his family, it was the ultimate betrayal. Whispers of traitor followed him like a shadow. Uncles and cousins who had known him since birth now looked at him with a mixture of fear and contempt. The community was instantly and violently divided. You were either for the old ways or you stood with the kinslayer. There was no middle ground. This was the first drop of blood. It wasn't spilled by a bullet, but by an oath. By pinning on that badge, Bud Hatfield had drawn a line not on a map, but through the heart of his own family. From that moment on, he was no longer just Bud Hatfield. He was Deputy Hatfield. And for men like his cousin, Bad Lears, who saw the badge as a declaration of war, it made him a target. The confrontation was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The confrontation was inevitable, and it happened, as so many things in that country do, by the river. Bud Hatfield and his posse cornered his cousin, Bad Lias, at the ferry landing. The water of the tug fork was slow and brown, the air thick with tension. It wasn't a long standoff. There were no grand speeches. There was only the low, steady voice of Sheriff Hatfield ordering his own blood to surrender, and the wild, defiant laugh of Bad Lias in response. For a moment, the two men stood as living symbols of the two worlds colliding, the old, lawless clan and the new, iron-willed law. What happened next took less time than a single breath, but the silence it created would last forever. There was no Hollywood gunfight, no men diving for cover. There was only a sudden, blurred movement, and then the calm was shattered by a deafening roar that echoed off the water and slammed into the hills. It was followed almost instantly by a second shot, so close to the first they sounded like a single stuttered clap of thunder. The posse froze, their own guns still in their holsters. When the sharp, acrid smell of gun smoke cut through the damp air, Bad Lias was no longer standing. He was on his knees, his head bowed, looking not at his cousin, but down at the wooden planks of the landing. He stayed that way for a single, long second, a statue of defeat. Then, without a sound, he simply pitched forward, his fall making a dull, hollow thud that seemed shockingly loud in the sudden quiet. From across the river, a person would have seen almost nothing. Just two men facing each other, a puff of white smoke quickly stolen by the breeze, and then one man falling. They would not have seen any blood. They would only have seen a dark stain begin to slowly spread across the back of the fallen man's shirt, like a shadow growing in the afternoon sun. The true horror wasn't in the wound, but in the stillness that followed. Bud Hatfield walked forward, his boots making heavy, deliberate sounds on the ferry landing. He stood over the body of his kinsman, his own pistol still smoking in his hand. The pearl handle, they say, felt as cold as a river stone against his palm. He did not speak. He did not offer a prayer. He simply looked down at what the law had required of him. Members of the posse would later whisper that the most terrifying part was the look in Sheriff Hatfield's eyes. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't remorse. It was a chilling, empty calm, the look of a man who had just performed a necessary but terrible piece of work. A Hatfield had killed a Hatfield. In that moment, the old world of clan justice didn't just die. It was executed on a riverbank by one of its own sons. To understand what went through Bud Hatfield's mind on that ferry landing, you must first understand that he likely didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a surgeon. In his cold, calculated view, his cousin, Bad Lias, wasn't a man anymore. He was a disease. He was the living embodiment of the chaos and violence that was strangling the mountains, the very sickness that Bud had sworn an oath to cure. His twisted logic was terrifyingly simple. To save the body, you must cut out the cancer. In that moment, the bond of blood was meaningless. It was an old-world sentiment that had no place in the new order he was trying to build. He wasn't executing his cousin. He was executing a problem. The true transformation didn't happen in the flash of gunfire. It happened in the quiet moment he first pinned the badge to his chest. That act was a silent vow to kill the part of himself that was a Hatfield clansman. He had to consciously sever the ties of blood and tradition that had defined his entire life. To become Sheriff Hatfield, Bud Hatfield, the cousin, had to die. So when Bad Lias made his move, there was no internal struggle. There was no hesitation. The switch had been flipped months ago. He was no longer acting as a man, but as an instrument of the law he had chosen to serve, and instruments do not feel conflict. As he drew his pistol, the world would have narrowed to a single point, the threat in front of him. His years of relentless practice took over, his mind becoming a place of chilling calm. There was no anger, no hatred, not even a flicker of sadness for the boy he once knew. There was only a target, a distance, and a trigger to be pulled. It was the detached, predatory focus of a hunter, but his prey was his own family. He was operating on a level of pure, brutal efficiency that few men could comprehend, let alone achieve. And afterward, standing in the gun smoke over his cousin's body, he would not have felt triumph or relief. He would have felt a profound and chilling emptiness. It was the quiet that comes after a storm has passed, the silence of a void created where something used to be. He had proven his loyalty to the law, but the price was a piece of his own soul. He had become what the county needed him to be, a monster to hunt monsters, but in doing so, he had become a stranger to his own kin and perhaps even to himself. The legend of the fearless lawman was born in that moment, but so was the ghost of the kinslayer that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The silence that fell on the ferry landing was heavier than a tombstone. Bud Hatfield's posse stood frozen, men who had seen their share of violence now stunned into stillness, not by the death, but by the identity of the killer and the killed. Sheriff Hatfield broke the spell. His voice was flat, devoid of any emotion, as if he were cataloguing supplies. He gave orders to secure the body and retrieve his cousin's weapon. He treated the scene with the cold, methodical procedure of a man clearing away a fallen tree from a road. There was no room for grief or hesitation. The law had been served, and now the paperwork had to follow. The body of Bad Lias was brought back to town, laid out on the back of a wagon. That grim procession was the only announcement needed. The news didn't travel by wire. It moved like a ghost, whispered from porch to porch, from one hollow to the next. A Hatfield has killed a Hatfield. The words carried a terrible weight, a sacrilege against the deepest code of the mountains. It was a wound cut into the very soul of the clan, a wound that would fester and poison everything it touched. For the Hatfield family, it was a moment of profound and terrible clarity. The lines were drawn. Doors that had always been open to Bud were now silently, permanently barred. Eyes that once held kinship now held a cold, hard judgment. They did not raise their guns against him, not yet. Their reaction was a silence more menacing than any threat. He was no longer one of them. He was an outsider, a tool of the very government they had fought for generations. He was a kinslayer. In the eyes of his own blood, his badge was not a symbol of honor, but the brand of a traitor. The official reaction was the polar opposite. The county prosecutor reviewed Bud's report, a document as blunt and efficient as the man who wrote it. It was a lawful killing. Bad Lias had resisted arrest. He had drawn his weapon. The men of the posse, shaken but loyal to their sheriff, corroborated the story. The officials who had hired Bud let out a collective sigh of relief. They had unleashed a force of nature, and it was working. He had done the unthinkable, the very thing no one else had the stomach to do. They saw a hero, a man bringing order through righteous, necessary violence. His power was solidified, his legend cemented in the halls of the courthouse. But for Bud, the hunt was just beginning. It was not a hunt for another outlaw, but a lifelong hunt for a peace he would never find. He had made his choice, and now he had to live in the world he had created, a world where he was feared by all and trusted by none. The ashes of his old life were all around him, the family he had forsaken, the traditions he had shattered. He was the law, but he was utterly alone, a solitary figure standing in the chilling silence that follows the final, fatal shot. The killing of Bad Lias split the county like a bolt of lightning hitting a 100-year-old oak. There was no middle ground left, no place for neutrality. Every single person, from the coal baron in his fine house to the farmer scratching a living from a rocky hillside, was forced to choose. The general store became a silent battlefield. A man's loyalty could be judged by who he tipped his hat to and whose gaze he avoided. A woman buying flour would fall silent if a known supporter of the sheriff walked in, the friendly chatter dying as if a cold wind had blown through the room. It was a war fought with averted eyes, tight-lipped smiles, and doors that suddenly wouldn't open. An unspoken conspiracy of silence descended upon the hills. Many knew the official story of the shooting was too clean, too simple. They'd heard whispers of a different tale, that Bad Lias was trying to surrender, that the second shot was unnecessary. But who would dare say so? To speak against Sheriff Hatfield was to invite a visit in the dead of night. People who had once been proud and outspoken now looked at their own children and chose to hold their tongues. Fear was a more effective lawman than Bud Hatfield could ever be, and it kept the community locked in a state of terrified paralysis. The truth, whatever it was buried alive under the weight of that silence. But even in the deepest fear, there were small acts of courage and cowardice that revealed the true heart of the people. A merchant, once a friend of Bad Lias, now made a point to give Sheriff Hatfield a discount, a public display of his newfound allegiance. A preacher, caught between his fear of the lawman and his fear of God, delivered a sermon on the sin of Cain that was so full of careful, veiled language that both sides could claim it as their own. Then there were the quiet acts of defiance. An old woman from a distant branch of the Hatfield family walked 10 miles to lay a single wildflower on Bad Lias's unmarked grave. A miner, his face black with coal dust, was heard to mutter "Kinslayer" as Bud rode past, a single word of rebellion that could have cost him his life. And the McCoys, the old enemies, they said nothing at all. They just watched, their silence one of grim satisfaction as their great rival, the House of Hatfield, began to devour itself from within. The death of Bad Lias was not an end, it was a declaration. With that single act, Sheriff Bud Hatfield had served notice to every outlaw, moonshiner, and hot-blooded brawler in the county. The old ways were over. His posse was no longer made of Hatfield cousins riding to defend the clan's honor. It was a new breed of man. They were young, grim-faced deputies who owed their loyalty not to a family name, but to the paycheck and the terrifying man who signed it. They followed him into the darkest hollows, not out of camaraderie, but out of a deep-seated fear of what he would do to them if they refused. They knew they were not his kin, they were his tools. The hunt for fugitives under Sheriff Hatfield became a new kind of Appalachian horror story. He didn't send his deputies, he led them. And when he went into the mountains, he was no longer a lawman. He was a predator returning to his natural habitat. The very skills the feud had taught him, how to track a man through dense rhododendron thickets, how to read a footprint in a creek bed, how to move through the woods without making a sound, were now turned against the very people who lived by that same code. The mountains that had for generations served as a fortress for the clans, hiding them from the outside world, had now become Bud Hatfield's personal hunting preserve. When a warrant was issued, a chilling game of cat and mouse began. The fugitive would run to the hills, believing himself safe in the familiar terrain. But he wasn't just being chased, he was being stalked. Bud was relentless, a force of nature that did not sleep or tire. Men on the run would tell stories of going days without seeing him, only to find the ashes of a campfire still warm, just 100 yards from where they had slept. They would hear a branch snap in the dead of night and know, with a certainty that chilled their blood, that it wasn't a deer. The psychological toll was immense. They weren't just running from the law, they were running from a ghost who knew every secret trail and every hidden cave. The moment of capture was rarely a chaotic firefight. More often, it was a scene of terrifying quiet. After days of being worn down by exhaustion and paranoia, the cornered man would look up to see Bud Hatfield standing at the edge of his camp, a Colt revolver held loosely at his side. He wouldn't shout or make demands. He would just stand there, his eyes flat and cold, his presence promising a swift and final violence if the wrong choice was made. Faced with that unflinching, predatory stare, most men simply gave up. Hardened killers who had sworn they'd never be taken alive would slowly raise their hands, their will to fight completely broken. They understood in that silent moment that they were not facing a man, but a reckoning. The hunt would end not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs, a sound that signaled the total and absolute surrender of the old world to the new law of the mountains. The Logan County Courthouse once a sleepy building of legal debate, transformed under Bud Hatfield's reign. It became a theater of fear. When the sheriff brought a prisoner to trial, the room was packed not with curious onlookers, but with a silent, tense audience of clan members and enemies, all watching each other. Armed deputies, loyal only to Bud, stood at every exit, their presence a constant, unspoken threat. The air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with legal arguments. It was the ancient tension of the mountains, of blood feuds and violent retribution, now brought indoors and wrapped in the thin veneer of official procedure. The trials themselves became a grim formality. The defendants Bud brought in didn't swagger or boast. They stood before the judge with the hollow-eyed look of a cornered animal that has already accepted its fate. Their real trial hadn't happened in the courtroom. It had occurred days earlier in a dark hollow at the end of a relentless manhunt when they looked up and saw Bud Hatfield emerge from the trees. By the time they reached the courthouse, their spirit was already broken. Their reaction was not one of defiance, but of quiet, defeated submission. Even the sharpest lawyers learned a new set of rules. You did not aggressively cross-examine Sheriff Hatfield. You did not challenge his account of the arrest. To do so was to imply he was a liar, and you could feel the temperature in the room drop when it happened. Witnesses for the prosecution spoke with a newfound clarity, while those for the defense often found their memories grew foggy under the weight of the sheriff's quiet, unblinking stare from the front row. It wasn't jury tampering in the traditional sense, it was an atmosphere of pure, suffocating intimidation. The verdicts, when they came, were swift and almost always the same: guilty. The conviction rate in Logan County skyrocketed. The payroll robberies stopped. The open brawling ceased. On paper, it was a staggering success. The law of men, with its procedures and its juries, was finally working. But a chilling question hung over every conviction, whispered on the courthouse steps after the prisoner had been dragged away in chains. Was this truly justice? Or had Bud Hatfield simply brought the old ways of the mountains inside the courthouse walls? He had not replaced the clan's code with the state's law. He had merged them into something new and terrifying. He used the tools of the state, the badge, the courts, the prisons, to enforce his own absolute, iron-willed version of mountain justice. The mastermind of it all was Bud himself, and he was never on trial. He was the judge, jury, and executioner long before any gavel fell. The people of Logan County had order, but many wondered if they had sacrificed justice to get it. After the trials were over and the jail cells were full, the Hatfield clan did not declare open war on their cousin. They did something far colder, far more final. They simply erased him. He became a ghost in his own family tree, a name spoken only in whispers of contempt. To the world, he was the powerful Sheriff Hatfield, but to the people who shared his blood, he was a dead man walking. The price for his iron-fisted order was a profound and permanent exile. He had brought the law to the mountains, but in the process, he had lost his home. Bud's life became a strange paradox. He was the most powerful man in the county, yet he was also the most alone. He walked the streets of Logan, a solitary king, his throne built on fear, and his kingdom populated by subjects who hated him. The justice he escaped in the courthouse found him in the shadows. Attempts on his life became a regular occurrence. A rifle shot that echoed from a distant ridge, narrowly missing his head. A stick of dynamite found under a bridge he was about to cross. He survived them all, his uncanny instincts and sheer, stubborn meanness keeping death at bay. But it was a life lived on a razor's edge, a constant grinding war of attrition. The mountains themselves seemed to hold a grudge, and every rustling leaf, every snapping twig was a potential threat. He was not a lawman. He was a warden in a prison of his own making. Whether he was truly haunted by the ghost of Bad Lias, as the campfire tales claimed, is a question that lies buried with him. But those who knew him in his later years described a man hollowed out from the inside. The chilling calm he displayed at the ferry landing became his permanent state. The silence around him wasn't just a result of the fear he inspired, it was a reflection of the silence within his own soul. He had made a deal to bring order, but the cost was a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, of seeing his cousin's face in the eyes of every man he arrested, and of knowing that the blood he spilled could never be washed away. This was his true sentence, not a curse from a ghost, but the relentless atonement of a man living with the consequences of an unforgivable choice. As the years passed, and Bud's era of iron rule eventually faded, the community did what communities do after a great trauma. It chose to forget. It was easier to talk about the Hatfield-McCoy feud, a distant, almost romantic conflict, than to speak of the time when a Hatfield hunted Hatfields. The story was too raw, too close, a mirror that showed a reflection of themselves they did not want to see. The tale of Sheriff Bud Hatfield, the kinslayer who brought order, was buried under new roads, new coal mines, and a thick, heavy blanket of willful silence. Today, the name Hatfield is known across the world, often romanticized as a symbol of rugged Appalachian defiance. Tourists flock to see the statue of Devil Anse, the great patriarch, standing proudly in a family cemetery. But there is no statue for Sheriff Bud Hatfield. For his descendants, the inheritance is a far more complicated thing. They carry a name associated not with a legendary feud, but with a kinslaying. It's a legacy of uncomfortable silence, a chapter of the family history that is rarely spoken of, a ghost that still lingers at the edge of family gatherings. The physical traces of his reign are faint, like old scars on the land. The courthouse in Logan may have been replaced by a newer building, but the spot where it stood remains a symbol of his absolute power, a place where the law of men was bent to the will of one man. But the true monument to his legacy is unmarked, and it lies on a quiet stretch of the Tug Fork River. There is no plaque, no cross to mark the spot where Bad Lias fell. It is just an ordinary ferry landing, a place where the slow brown water slips past the banks, holding its secrets close. It is a place of profound and terrible memory, hiding in plain sight. The official records of his arrests and the newspaper articles praising his efficiency still exist, gathering dust in archives. But the true story of Sheriff Hatfield is no longer found in books. It has seeped back into the soil from which it came, becoming a piece of folklore. It lives on in the quiet conversations of old men on their porches, a cautionary tale told to grandsons about the danger of putting a badge before blood and the terrible price of absolute order. The coal mines have scarred the hills, new roads have been paved over the old horse trails, and the world has moved on. The people have forgotten, or perhaps have chosen to forget the specifics of that dark time. But the mountains have not. They were the silent witnesses to it all, to the oath, the hunt, and the final fatal shot on the riverbank. The mountains remember everything. So we return to the question that hung in the air like gun smoke on that fateful day. How does a Hatfield bring himself to kill a Hatfield for a tin star? The simple answer is that he didn't. Bud Hatfield wasn't fighting for the law of the state. He was fighting for his own brutal vision of survival. He saw a world of chaos and blood that was being devoured by an even greater predator, the coal companies and their armies of hired guns. He believed the old ways of the clan were a sentimental weakness, a path to extinction. So he made a terrible choice. He became a monster to save the mountains from other monsters, sacrificing his own family and his own soul in the process. This is a story not just of one complicated man, but of the brutal, heartbreaking bargain Appalachia was forced to make. It's a story about what happens when the forces of the modern world come for a land steeped in tradition, blood, and honor. Bud Hatfield is the personification of that collision. He was the iron will that brought order, but it was the order of the gallows, the peace of the graveyard. His life is a testament to the fact that sometimes the man who claims to be bringing civilization is more savage than the wilderness he is trying to tame. So the next time you hear the name Hatfield and you think of the famous feud, I want you to remember this story. Remember the man who was both a lawman and a kinslayer, a hero and a traitor, a savior and a beast. He was a man forged in the crucible of the mountains, who then used that fire to burn away the very world that created him, leaving behind nothing but the cold ashes of order. And now, my friends, another one of these forgotten stories has been told. You can find places like this all over Appalachia. A quiet spot on the edge of town where a creek whispers over smooth stones and the only sound is the rustle of leaves in the canopy above. It feels peaceful, timeless even. But this ground, right here on the outskirts of Winston-Salem, holds a memory soaked in blood and betrayal. Over a century ago, this gentle quiet was shattered by the crack of a pistol. This is the very spot where they found a young woman named Ellen Smith. Her life ended by a single bullet fired straight into her heart. Her story became a legend, immortalized in one of America's most famous murder ballads. But a song is not the whole truth. Today, we're going to peel back the layers of that old, mournful tune and listen for the real story. We're here to ask the questions the ballad never answered. Who was Ellen Smith? And why did the story of her death refuse to die? Let's turn back the clock to 1892. Winston-Salem, North Carolina, was a town caught between two worlds. The sweet, heavy scent of curing tobacco from the new R.J. Reynolds factories hung in the air, a promise of new money and new industry. But just beyond the town limits, the old ways of Appalachia held fast, a world of hard work, strict honor, and unwritten rules that could govern a person's life and death. It was a place of opportunity, but also a place where a person's reputation was everything, especially for a young woman trying to make her way alone. Into this world came Ellen Smith. She was barely 19, a girl from the surrounding foothills who, like so many others, was drawn to the town by the prospect of a steady wage. She found work as a maid at the Zinzendorf Hotel, a bustling hub where the wealthy tobacco barons mixed with travelers and local townsfolk. By all accounts, she was pretty, quiet, and hard-working. She carried out her duties, changing linens and serving meals, likely dreaming of a life far removed from the hard-scrabble farm she had left behind. She was just one of hundreds of anonymous girls hoping for a bit of luck, maybe even a bit of love. And then there was Peter de Graaf. If Ellen was invisible, Peter was anything but. He was handsome, always dressed in fine clothes, and moved with the easy confidence of a man whose father was a well-respected citizen. He had a place in society, a name that carried weight. But beneath that polished surface, a different reputation festered. Peter was known to be a heavy drinker, a gambler, a man with a taste for women and trouble. He was charming, yes, but it was a dangerous charm, the kind that promised excitement but often delivered ruin. Their worlds collided within the walls of the Zinzendorf Hotel. He, the privileged customer, she, the humble servant. It was a classic, perilous dynamic. A man like Peter de Graaf would have seen a girl like Ellen Smith as a simple conquest, a dalliance with no consequences. But for Ellen, the attention of such a man, someone so far above her station, must have felt like a fairy tale. He was a glimpse into a world of comfort and status she could only dream of. And so, it began. An affair that was, for a time, an open secret whispered about in the hotel kitchens and the town's back alleys. Peter would visit her. They'd be seen walking together near the edge of town, away from judging eyes. To the rest of the world, it was a familiar, predictable story. But for the two people living it, it was a path that was quickly leading them toward a dark and unforgiving horizon, a point from which neither of them would ever truly return. A story like this isn't just found in the dirt and leaves of a crime scene. The real evidence, the kind that survives a century, is often buried in a different kind of silence, the quiet hush of a library archive. That's where the whispers from the past are preserved, pressed between the pages of old books and captured on reels of microfilm. And that's where I found this, a newspaper clipping from the summer of 1892, just a few days after Ellen's body was discovered. At first glance, it's what you'd expect. The headline is sensational, talking of a dastardly deed and a shocking murder. It names Peter de Graaf as the prime suspect. But the official facts are not the most important thing on this page. Tucked away in the third paragraph is a single, carefully worded phrase. The article mentions the town's rampant speculation about the victim's unfortunate condition. You see, this isn't just a piece of paper. It's a fossilized rumor. In the polite, coded language of the Victorian era, unfortunate condition meant only one thing. Ellen Smith was believed to be pregnant with Peter de Graaf's child. This single, unproven whisper, printed for all to see, was the spark that lit the fuse. Suddenly, this wasn't just a story of a lover's quarrel. It was a story of honor, shame, and desperation. This one sentence transforms the entire narrative. The affair was no longer a secret dalliance, it became a time bomb. For Peter, it was a threat to his engagement to a more suitable woman and a stain on his family's good name. For Ellen, it was a last, desperate hope for legitimacy. The question this old newspaper forces us to ask is a heavy one. How does a whispered rumor in a small southern town build enough pressure to end in a gunshot? That newspaper clipping only reported what everyone was whispering. But for Ellen and Peter, that rumor was a stark, terrifying reality. Imagine a hushed, desperate conversation in a shadowed corner of the hotel, away from the prying eyes of guests and staff. This is where the love story, if it ever was one, truly died, and the countdown to tragedy began. Ellen, likely terrified but resolute, would have told Peter about the child. For her, it was a plea for salvation. In that moment, she wasn't just his lover. She was the mother of his heir, and in the unwritten code of the mountains, that demanded action. She would have asked him to do the right thing, to marry her and give their child a name. Peter de Graaf, however, was already promised to another woman, Fanny Faust, a bride his family approved of. Ellen's news was not a blessing, it was a catastrophe. It was a threat to his reputation, his inheritance, and his entire future. The easy charm he had used to woo her would have vanished, replaced by a cold panic. To him, her plea for marriage was not a request for honor, but an ultimatum that could unravel his entire world. The days that followed must have been a private hell for both of them. Their secret meetings would no longer have been filled with affection, but with bitter arguments. He likely offered her money, told her to leave town and never come back, to solve the problem on her own. But Ellen wouldn't have backed down. For her, this was not a problem to be disposed of. It was her life, her child's life. Her desperation would have made her bold, perhaps even threatening to expose him to his family and his fiancée. What started as a whispered secret between two people was now a festering conflict. Every denial from him would have fueled her resolve. Every tearful plea from her would have deepened his fear. The seeds of conflict were sown not in jealousy or simple hatred, but in a clash of two inescapable realities. She needed a husband to avoid ruin, and he needed to get rid of her to avoid the very same fate. The air between them grew thick with unspoken violence, and time was running out. Newspaper clippings and court records can give you the skeleton of a story, but they can't give you its soul. For that, you have to talk to the people who keep the memories alive. I found that soul in a conversation with a local historian, a man whose great-grandfather had known the de Graaf family. He wasn't a professor in some university. He was a man whose family had lived on this soil for 200 years, and whose memory was a library of local lore. We sat on his porch, overlooking the hazy blue line of the distant mountains. He told me the official story, the one we all know. The affair, the rumored pregnancy, the arrest. But then he leaned forward in his rocking chair, his voice dropping a little lower. "Now, this part you won't find in any court record," he said. "This is the story that was passed down. The papers will tell you Peter had a motive, but they don't tell you why it had to happen on that specific day. According to the tale that's been told around here for over a century, Ellen Smith had given Peter de Graaf an ultimatum. It wasn't just a tearful plea for marriage anymore. She was done with his stalling and his empty promises. She told him that if he didn't agree to marry her, she was going to walk over to his father's house that very afternoon and tell the old man everything. Suddenly, the timeline snaps into sharp, terrifying focus. This wasn't a problem Peter could put off until next week. It was a crisis with a deadline measured in hours. Exposing the secret to his prominent father would have brought immediate and absolute ruin. It was one thing for the town to whisper, but for the patriarch of the de Graaf family to hear it from Ellen herself. That was unthinkable. Peter, cornered and desperate, knew he had to stop her, and he had to do it right then. This personal testimony, passed down through generations, gives us the missing piece of the puzzle, the emotional trigger for what was about to happen. The ultimatum hung in the hot, still air between them. It wasn't a tearful plea anymore. It was a declaration. Ellen was going to his father's house, today. For Peter de Graaf, the world had just shrunk to the size of a ticking clock, and every second brought ruin closer. The charming dandy, the confident man about town, was gone. In his place was a cornered animal, staring down the collapse of his carefully constructed life. The whispers of the town were one thing. A public confrontation with his father was another. It meant the end of his engagement, the loss of his inheritance, and the fury of a patriarch whose name he was about to disgrace. He couldn't let her get to that house. He had to stop her. But he couldn't do it in the open. He needed to move her away from the center of town, away from prying eyes, away from anyone who might hear an argument or a scream. And so, the mask of the charmer went back on, one last, terrible time. He would have softened his voice, feigned surrender. He likely told her she was right, that they needed to talk it through properly, away from the hotel. "Let's walk," he would have suggested, "down by the water race, where we can be alone. We'll figure this out." Did a flicker of hope ignite in Ellen's heart? Did she believe for just a moment that her desperate gamble had worked, that he was finally going to do the right thing? Or did a cold knot of fear tighten in her stomach? We will never know. But we know she agreed. Perhaps she felt she had no choice but to see it through. So she walked with him, away from the safety of the busy streets, away from the life she knew. Each step they took together was a step further from her world and deeper into his. They made their way toward the outskirts of town, toward the secluded spot by the old paper mill. The path would have grown quieter, the sounds of the town replaced by the buzz of insects and the steady rush of the water in the race. It was a sound loud enough to swallow other sounds. It was a place for secrets. They were alone now. No one to see them, no one to hear them. The pretense could finally be dropped. This was not a place for reconciliation. It was a place for a final, brutal resolution. The time for talk, for lies, for empty promises was over. The time for consequences had arrived. Standing there, with the sound of the water in his ears and the threat of his ruin standing before him, Peter de Graaf made his choice. In that moment, the path forward narrowed to a single violent act. There was no turning back. And so, I've come back to this place. The old paper mill is long gone, its foundations swallowed by a century of weeds and vines. But the path is still here, and the water race, though now just a shallow, meandering creek, still whispers the same story to the stones. There are no historical markers, no monuments. This place has been allowed to forget, to let nature cover up the memory of what happened here. But the scar is the landscape itself. There are no bullet holes in a wall to show you, no faded bloodstains preserved under glass. The evidence is the geography of the crime. Look how secluded it is, even now. You can see how the thicket of trees would have swallowed them, hiding them from the road. You can hear how the constant rush of the water would have been just loud enough to muffle the sound of a raised voice or a single sharp crack of a pistol. This is the real, physical proof. This clearing was not a random spot. It was chosen. This was the end of the line. Standing here, in the same oppressive summer humidity they would have felt, you can almost hear the final desperate words exchanged. This wasn't a sudden burst of rage. This was an execution, planned in the desperate few minutes it took to walk from the edge of town into this green, silent tomb. Right here, in this quiet, forgotten clearing, the final brutal act of our story unfolded. The time for lies was over. Standing in that secluded clearing, Ellen would have stood her ground, her voice steady with the conviction of a woman with nothing left to lose. She would have repeated her ultimatum one last time. I am going to your father's house. I am going to tell him everything. Those were the words that sealed her fate. For Peter de Graaf, the sound of the rushing water faded away, and the world narrowed to this single, unmovable obstacle standing between him and his future. The panic that had been churning inside him cooled into a terrible, simple clarity. He would have felt the weight in his coat pocket, a heavy, cold reassurance. He had likely brought it with him for this very purpose, a final option he hoped he wouldn't have to use. But her resolve, her refusal to be silenced or sent away, had exhausted all other possibilities. In his mind, she had backed him into this clearing, into this moment. There was only one way he could walk out of here alone, with his secret safe and his future intact. The choice was made. And then, the argument ended. It ended not with a resolution, but with a sharp, violent punctuation. A single, sharp report cracked the humid air, a sound far too loud and deliberate to be a snapping twig. It was a sound that ripped through the drone of the insects and the murmur of the creek, echoing off the trees for a brief moment before being swallowed by the woods. A flock of startled birds erupted from the canopy, their panicked calls the only immediate response to the unnatural noise. There would have been no scream, just a look of profound, final surprise on Ellen's face. A flicker of disbelief as she looked down at her own chest, as if to understand what had just happened. Her hands, which might have been clenched in anger or raised in pleading, fell limp to her sides. She crumpled to the ground without a sound, a final, soft exhalation of breath, the only testament to the life that had just been stolen from her. The vibrant, determined young woman was gone, replaced by a still, silent form. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the creek and the slow settling of dust motes in the shafts of afternoon sun. The air grew thick with the acrid smell of burnt powder. Peter would have stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs, staring at what he had done. There she was, poor Ellen Smith, lying on the cold, cold ground. A single dark circle, no bigger than a coin, began to blossom on the fabric of her simple dress right over her heart. It was a neat, tidy, and absolutely final solution to his problem. Then, the cold clarity shattered, and the animal panic returned. His survival instinct screamed at him to run. He turned his back on what he had done, on the woman who had carried his child and his secret. He didn't look back. The rustle of his footsteps, quick and desperate through the underbrush, was the last human sound to disturb the scene. The woods swallowed him up, leaving behind only an awful, profound silence. And in the clearing, the sun continued to shine, the water continued to flow, and the birds eventually returned to their branches. Nature, indifferent and eternal, began the slow work of reclaiming the scene. Ellen Smith was left alone, with only the indifferent sky and the whispering trees as witnesses to her final moments. The story of the violence lives in the soil of that clearing, but the story of the aftermath is preserved in a different kind of silence, the quiet, dusty archives of the Forsyth County Courthouse. Here, the raw, human tragedy of Ellen Smith's death was translated into the cold, formal language of the law. I've held the photocopies in my own hands. The coroner's report, the court docket, the arrest warrant. Each one tells a piece of the story, but it's a version scrubbed clean of all emotion. The coroner's inquest is a marvel of clinical detachment. It describes the location where the body was found and the position in which she was lying. And then, the cause of death is recorded with chilling simplicity. Gunshot wound. That's it. Just 2 words to extinguish a life filled with hope, fear, and a desperate love. There is no mention of the rumored child, no hint of the ultimatum that signed her death warrant. The official record reduces the entire complex tragedy of Ellen's final moments to a simple medical observation. Then you see Peter de Graaf's name for the first time in the court's ledger. The state versus Peter de Graaf. Charge, murder. Black ink on a ruled line. The paper doesn't record the terror he must have felt as he fled through the woods. It doesn't acknowledge the powerful weight of his family's name or the public's immediate, overwhelming assumption of his guilt. It just lays out a simple, brutal equation. 1 victim, 1 accused. The entire storm of passion and desperation is boiled down to a case number. Reading these documents is like looking at a photograph of a house fire. You see the structure, the smoke, the event itself. But you can't feel the heat. You can't hear the screams. You can't smell the ash. The law is concerned with facts, with evidence that can be presented to a jury. It has no vocabulary for the intricate web of honor, shame, and class that drove these 2 people to that secluded spot. But these dry, impartial papers, for all their lack of soul, were about to set in motion a manhunt that would make Peter de Graaf a household name across the state. The law, once set in motion by those cold documents, moved with surprising speed. Suspicion fell on Peter de Graaf like a hawk on a field mouse, swift, singular, and absolute. He was her known lover. He had the motive, and he was the last person seen with her. He was arrested and charged with the murder of Ellen Smith. But in the courtroom, Peter was a different man from the panicked killer who fled the woods. He was unnervingly calm, dressed impeccably, denying everything with a steady voice. The evidence against him was powerful, but purely circumstantial. There was no murder weapon, no confession, no one who saw him pull the trigger. The prosecution built a case on motive and opportunity, while the defense chipped away at the lack of hard proof. The jury was torn, and the result was a mistrial. For a moment it seemed Peter de Graaf might just walk free. But a guilty man with a reprieve is a dangerous thing. Before a second trial could be convened, Peter made a move that would seal his fate more surely than any piece of evidence. With the help of his brother, he soared through the bars of his jail cell and, under the cover of a moonless night, vanished. To the public, this was the ultimate confession. An innocent man stands and fights for his name. A guilty man runs for his life. His escape transformed him from a suspect into a condemned fugitive in the eyes of the entire state. The law was no longer just seeking a conviction. It was now hunting a man who had made a mockery of it. The manhunt was vast. Telegraphs crackled with his description, and his name was on the lips of lawmen from Virginia to Tennessee. Months went by. The trail went cold. It seemed Peter de Graaf had been swallowed by the continent. Then, a tip came from a world away. He was found hundreds of miles from North Carolina, hiding in the most unlikely of places, working as a common hand in a traveling circus in Robinson, Kansas. The dapper man about town had become a ghost, living amongst the clowns and the carnies. The long arm of the law finally closed around him there, and he was brought back to Winston-Salem in chains, the spectacle of his capture only fueling the public's certainty of his guilt. His second trial was a formality. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with condemnation. This time, there was no doubt, no hesitation. The prosecution now had the most damning evidence of all: his flight from justice. The jury didn't need to see a weapon. They saw a man who had run, and they knew why. The trial was swift, the arguments a foregone conclusion. The jury filed out and returned in what must have felt like a heartbeat. The court clerk asked for the verdict. A silence fell over the room, so heavy you could feel the weight of it in your chest. The foreman, a grim-faced farmer, rose to his feet, unfolded a small piece of paper, and spoke the single word that everyone had come to hear: guilty. The dry legal process that began with a line of ink in a ledger had found its final, brutal endpoint. Peter de Graaf was sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. Every story has an end, and for the people who live them, that end is often found in a place like this, the old Salem Cemetery. It's a quiet library of stone, where the final chapters of thousands of lives are etched into granite and marble. I came here to find the last, quiet resting places of the two people at the heart of our story. It doesn't take long to find Ellen's. Her grave is marked by a simple flat stone, a humble marker that lies low in the grass, easily missed if you aren't looking for it. There is no grand epitaph, just her name and the dates that bookend her short, tragic life. It is a lonely grave for a girl who died alone. And yet, her story has kept this spot from being forgotten. People still come. They know the ballad, and they seek out this small stone as a kind of pilgrimage. Her final resting place is as modest as the life she lived, but the legend that grew from it is monumental. In death, the poor, forgotten maid became more famous than any of the wealthy people buried around her. Then, you walk just 100 yards or so past other weathered stones, and you find the de Graaf family plot. And there he is, Peter de Graaf. His marker is part of a respectable family collection, more substantial than Ellen's, but weathered by the same century of sun and rain. And the irony is so thick you can almost taste it. He killed her to protect his family's name, to sever their connection forever. But here they lie, just a short walk from one another. Enemies in life, neighbors for all eternity in this silent city of the dead. Seeing these two stones, so close and yet worlds apart, makes you realize that the gallows was not the end of the story. It was only the end of Peter's. For the families left behind, for the community that had witnessed the tragedy, the consequences were just beginning to unfold. The final verdict had been delivered, but the long shadow of that day was only starting to stretch across the land. On February 8, 1894, a massive crowd gathered in Winston-Salem. It was a public holiday of the grimmest sort. They came to see Peter de Graaf hang. He was led to the gallows, and even in his final moments, he maintained his unnerving calm. He refused to confess. He did not ask for forgiveness. And here, the history of the event blurs into the legend. The story, the one that truly matters, is that as he stood on the gallows, with the rope around his neck, he handed a note to his brother. Some say it was a poem, a final confession scribbled on a scrap of paper. No one knows for sure if this note ever existed, but it didn't have to. The idea of it was enough. It was the confession the public craved, the final poetic admission of guilt that would become the very soul of the ballad. The trapdoor fell, and Peter de Graaf was gone. But the story was far from over. His execution did not bring peace. For Ellen Smith's family, there was no real victory. Their daughter was still gone, her name still tangled up in scandal. For the de Graaf family, the shame was permanent. Their son was a convicted murderer, his name a stain they would carry for generations. And for Fanny Fost, the woman Peter was supposed to marry, life was irrevocably altered. She had been saved from a marriage to a killer, but she would forever be known as the other woman in a famous murder case. The long shadow of that day fell across all of them. The survivors had to go on living in a town where every whisper, every knowing glance was a reminder of the tragedy. They had to rebuild their lives on the fractured ground of a scandal that was already becoming a local legend. The law had delivered its justice, the guilty party had paid the ultimate price, but the human cost continued to be paid in quiet grief and public shame for years to come. The event was over, but the memory, raw and painful, had just begun its long, slow burn into the community's consciousness. You would think that a story with a body, a killer, a trial, and an execution would have a clear, definitive ending. But it rarely works that way. The song that bears Ellen's name paints the picture in stark black and white. There is a villain and there is a victim. Peter de Graaf is the cold-hearted killer, and Ellen Smith is the poor, innocent girl he murdered. For the rest of the world, for anyone who has ever heard that mournful tune, that is the end of the story. It is a simple, powerful, and enduring morality tale. But when you spend time here, when you talk to people whose roots run deep in this soil, you find that the truth is never that clean. In the whispers and memories that were never set to music, a different, more complicated picture emerges. While no one defends what Peter did, the telling of the story shifts. In this version, Ellen is not just a passive lamb led to the slaughter. She is a woman who, finding herself in a desperate situation, used the only weapon she had, the threat of public shame. She gave an ultimatum, a high-stakes gamble in a game where she held very few cards. Likewise, in this whispered history, Peter de Graaf isn't a simple monster. He is a weak man, a foolish man, trapped by his own vices and the rigid expectations of his family. He was a coward, driven to an act of unimaginable cruelty, not by pure evil, but by the desperate fear of losing his social standing. This doesn't excuse him. It doesn't absolve him of his crime. But it recasts the story from a simple melodrama into a more complicated and perhaps more human tragedy about two flawed people crushed by the unforgiving social codes of their time. So which version is the truth? Was Ellen the pure innocent from the ballad, or the desperate gambler from the local law? Was Peter a cold-blooded predator, or a cornered coward? The answer is likely lost somewhere in the middle, in the unspoken words that passed between them in that clearing. The official record tells one story, the famous ballad tells another, and the quiet, persistent memory of the community tells a third. The truth, as it so often does, depends entirely on who is telling the story. And this is how a story truly becomes immortal. It's not in the court records or the newspaper clippings. In the mountains, a story survives when it is set to music. Almost immediately after Peter de Graaf's execution, the tale of what he had done was put to a simple, mournful tune. These murder ballads were the lifeblood of Appalachian history, a way of preserving cautionary tales and shocking news in a time before radio or television. They were the people's history, sung on porches and in parlors, passed down from one generation to the next. The ballad of Poor Ellen Smith is a masterpiece of the form, chilling because it's told from the killer's point of view. It's not a song of remorse, but a cold, matter-of-fact confession. The lyrics, supposedly taken from that mythical note found on the gallows, captured the entire tragedy in a few unforgettable verses. It tells of the murder, the escape, the capture, and the final, lonely walk to the gallows. The song became so powerful, so definitive, that it completely overwrote the messy, complicated reality of the case. The legal arguments, the circumstantial evidence, the lack of a weapon, all of that faded away. The song became the truth. Over time, history dissolves and legend takes its place. The trauma of Ellen's death seeped into the very soil of this place, sprouting ghost stories. For 100 years, people have claimed to see a sorrowful apparition wandering the woods near the old water race, the ghost of a young woman in a simple dress, forever searching for the justice she was denied in life. The real Ellen Smith, the girl who worked at the hotel and dreamed of a better life, was gone. In her place was a folk hero, a ghost, and the title character of a timeless, haunting song, a cautionary tale that still echoes through these hills today. And so we find ourselves back where this journey began, here in this quiet clearing by the water. When we first stood here, it was just a peaceful spot in the woods, a place where nature had seemingly washed away the past. But it isn't quiet anymore, is it? Now, you can almost hear the echoes, the frantic, whispered argument, the single deafening crack of the pistol, and then the profound, awful silence that followed. We came here looking for the truth behind a famous song, And we found something far more raw and complicated. We found a story not just of a simple villain and a helpless victim, but of two desperate people trapped by the unforgiving social codes of their time. We found that the truth is rarely as clean as a ballad's verse. It's a powerful reminder that every forgotten place, every quiet wood like this one, has a story to tell if you're willing to listen. They are silent libraries, filled with tales of love, pride, and the terrible, irreversible choices that can change everything in a single heartbeat. The world that created Peter de Graaf and Ellen Smith is gone. The hotel she worked in, the gallows he died on, they have all vanished into time. The people themselves are little more than dust and whispers. But the ballad is still sung on porches and stages 100 years later. And the story remains. Imagine this for a moment. A 10-year-old boy and his 7-year-old sister, barefoot and bleeding, crashing through the Appalachian wilderness. In the boy's arms is a crying infant. They are the only thing left of their family. Behind them, in the chilling silence that always follows the screams, lies the ruin of their home and the bodies of their father and their 7 brothers. How does a family get wiped from the face of the earth in a single afternoon, leaving only children to tell the tale? The history books call it the Hannan family massacre, just another bloody footnote in the story of the American frontier. But that simple label hides a far darker and more complex truth. It hides the story of a forgotten war, of a visionary warrior fighting for his people's survival, and of a clash of worlds so violent it left ghosts that are said to haunt these mountains to this very day. Today, we journey back to that brutal summer of 1776 to find out what really happened on the day hell descended into a quiet mountain hollow. Before the screams, there was the quiet rhythm of a life being carved out of the wilderness. William Hannan's homestead was little more than a notch in the vast green cloak of the North Carolina mountains. A log cabin, sturdy and rough-hewn, stood in a small clearing, a testament to endless hours of labor. Around it, a field of corn and beans fought a daily battle against the encroaching forest. This was the frontier in 1776, not a place of grand adventure, but of grueling, back-breaking work from sunup to sundown. The forest was both a provider and a threat. It gave them timber for their home, game for their table, and cool water from its creeks. But it also held its secrets in a deep, watchful silence. William Hannan was a man defined by that silence. A widower, he was the sole guardian of 10 children, a responsibility that would have crushed a lesser man. His 5 eldest sons were already turning into men themselves, their hands calloused from the axe and the plow. They worked beside their father in the fields, their shared sweat watering the very ground they hoped to one day call their own. They weren't invaders in their own minds. They were builders, planters, men chasing the simple, universal dream of leaving something behind for their children. Inside the cabin, life was a hum of smaller chores. 10-year-old Edwin was already learning the weight of responsibility, while his 7-year-old sister Winnie was more mother than child to the 2 toddlers and the new baby, Elizabeth. Their world was small, bounded by the edge of the woods and the arc of the sun. Their joys were simple: a cool drink of water after a hot day's work, the rare taste of wild honey, the stories told by the firelight as the mountains outside grew dark and quiet. It was a hard life, but it was their life, whole and unbroken. But the year was 1776, and while men in Philadelphia were debating the birth of a new nation, the world these settlers knew was on the verge of a violent, bloody death. The winds of revolution that blew through the cities reached the mountains as distorted whispers, rumors carried by traders and traveling preachers. They spoke of war with the British, of independence, of freedom, words that felt distant and abstract in a place where survival was the only law that mattered. The more immediate danger had a name a name that was beginning to be spoken with a mix of fear and reluctant respect. Dragging Canoe. He was the leader of the Chickamauga Cherokee, a man who refused to bow to the white tide. Whispers said he had sworn a blood oath to drive the settlers from his ancestral lands. The Hannon family, in their quiet hollow, knew of these rumors. Every snap of a twig in the forest, every unfamiliar shadow at dusk, was a reminder that their small patch of cleared land was an island in an ocean of ancient history they did not understand. They were living on borrowed time, and they had no idea the debt was about to be called due. The Hannons had no quarrel with their immediate neighbors. On the frontier, you relied on the folks in the next valley over. No, the grudges that doomed them were older, deeper, and written on the land itself. William Hannon and his family were living on the edge of a wound that had been festering for decades. Each treaty signed by distant chiefs, each parcel of land ceded under pressure, was another drop of poison in the well. To the Cherokee, the settlers' cabins weren't homes. They were markers of a slow, creeping death to their way of life. The architect of this simmering rage was Dragging Canoe. He was a man who saw the future in the tired eyes of the old chiefs who kept giving away land, hoping for a peace that never came. At a treaty meeting, as yet another swath of ancestral hunting ground was signed over, he pointed to the land and spoke words that would become a prophecy written in blood. "You have bought a beautiful land," he told the settlers, "but I am afraid that you will find its settlement dark and bloody." He saw no compromise, only oblivion. Dragging Canoe and his followers, the Chickamauga, were not just a band of renegades. They were the hardened soul of the Cherokee resistance. They saw the American Revolution not as a fight for freedom, but as a chaotic opportunity. British agents, eager to sow terror on the colonial frontier, fanned the flames of their fury. They provided guns, ammunition, and promises, turning the Chickamauga's righteous anger into a weapon. For Dragging Canoe, this wasn't about fighting for the British king. It was a holy war for the mountains themselves. This web of intrigue and old hatreds created an atmosphere thick with paranoia. In the scattered settlements, rumors spread like wildfire. A hunter would report seeing unfamiliar tracks by the creek. A trader would bring news of Chickamauga war parties gathering in the hidden valleys. Whispers turned to warnings, and warnings turned to cold, hard fear. The Hannon family, like every other settler, would have felt it. The friendly waves they might have once exchanged with Cherokee hunters were gone, replaced by wary, assessing stares across the trees. The air itself had changed. It was no longer just the quiet of the mountains. It was the tense, listening silence before a storm. The point of no return wasn't a shouted argument or a line drawn in the dirt. It was a silent decision made in the deep shadows of the forest. It was the moment a Chickamauga war party, their faces painted in the colors of vengeance, began to move with purpose toward the smell of wood smoke from the Hannon cabin. For them, this wasn't murder. It was surgery. It was cutting out a cancer that was killing their world, one small homestead at a time. Every snapped twig under their moccasins was a drumbeat of inevitability. On the other side of that thin veil of trees, life continued in blissful ignorance. It was a hot, heavy summer afternoon. William Hannon and his 5 oldest boys were in the field, likely bent over their work, their backs slick with sweat. The rhythmic thud of a hoe against the earth, the drone of insects in the thick air, these were the sounds of their world. Their rifles, the essential tools of frontier survival, were likely propped against a stump at the edge of the clearing. In the quiet rhythm of their labor, the danger that had been a whisper for months had faded to a dull background hum. This was the fatal miscalculation of the frontier, the belief that because the morning was peaceful, the afternoon would be too. The Hannon men were tired, focused on the soil, their senses lulled by the heat. They didn't see the flicker of movement in the tree line. They didn't hear the collective intake of breath as dozens of eyes fixed on them from the shadows. The war party had reached the edge of the woods. They could see the unsuspecting figures in the field, see the faint outline of the cabin beyond. There was no turning back now. The promise made to Dragging Canoe, the anger fueled by British guns, the generations of grief for lost lands, it all coalesced into this one irreversible moment. A hand was raised. A silent signal was given. The deep, listening silence of the Appalachian forest was about to be broken by a sound that would echo through generations. It began with a sound that didn't belong in a peaceful afternoon. It wasn't the call of a bird or the snap of a twig, but the chilling, high-pitched war cry of the Chickamauga erupting from the tree line. For William Hannon and his 5 sons, there was no time to run, no time to even turn and grab their rifles. The world of hoeing and planting vanished in an instant, replaced by a storm of motion and violence that swept over the field. It wasn't a battle, it was a harvest. Moments later, it was over. The rhythmic sounds of work had been replaced by a silence that was heavy and absolute. 6 men who had been toiling under the sun were now part of the very earth they had been turning. From the cabin, one could only see the aftermath, the still figures lying in the dirt and the attackers moving among them. One warrior stood over the body of William Hannon and with a swift, practiced motion raised a dark, bloody proof of his victory to the sky before disappearing back into the shadows of the forest. Inside the cabin, the screams from the field had been cut short, leaving a ringing void that was even more terrifying. 10-year-old Edwin and 7-year-old Winnie huddled together, trying to quiet the 2 toddlers and the crying infant, Elizabeth. Then came a new sound, the splintering of their own front door. It burst inward, and the small, dim cabin was suddenly filled with huge, terrifying shadows. The air grew thick with the scent of sweat, rage, and something metallic that the children didn't understand. The warriors' eyes, accustomed to the dim light of the forest, scanned the cabin. They saw the children. In the merciless logic of a war for survival, these were not children. They were the seeds of their enemy, seeds that could not be allowed to grow. One of the warriors moved toward the 3-year-old boy, who was crying in terror. There was a small, sharp scream, followed by a sickeningly dull thud against the log wall, and then silence. The newborn, Elizabeth, began to wail, her infant cries filling the cabin. Another warrior moved toward her. But in that moment, in that bloody, chaotic frenzy, something happened. Perhaps the warriors were spooked by a sound. Perhaps they believed their work was done and were eager to leave. For one critical second, their attention was diverted. It was all the time the universe would give. It wasn't a thought, but a pure animal instinct that moved 10-year-old Edwin. As the warrior turned away, the boy lunged, scooping the screaming infant from her cradle. He grabbed Winnie's hand, pulling her with a force she didn't know he possessed. He didn't look back at the small, still form of his little brother. He didn't look at anything but the gaping hole where the door used to be. They slipped out of the cabin like 2 small ghosts, leaving their own grave. Barefoot, with a screaming baby in their arms, they ran. They didn't run toward the fields where their father lay. They ran for the one place that had always seemed so dark and threatening, the only place that now offered salvation, the deep, silent woods. They plunged into the shadows, the thorny branches tearing at their skin, running from the silence that had just fallen over their home, a silence now more terrifying than any scream. For what felt like an eternity, Edwin and Winnie ran, fueled by a terror that numbed the pain of thorns and sharp rocks under their bare feet. The only reality was the weight of the baby in Edwin's arms and the desperate, ragged sound of their own breathing. They finally stumbled out of the tree line and into the clearing of the nearest farmstead, collapsing in a heap of exhaustion and shock. They were a horrifying sight. 2 children covered in scratches, their eyes wide with a horror no words could yet explain, and a wailing infant. But the message they brought didn't need words. It was carried in their silence and their tears. Within the hour, a grim-faced party of neighbors, rifles in hand, made their way cautiously toward the Hannon homestead. The first thing they noticed was the silence. The familiar sounds of a working farm, the chop of an axe, the call of a voice were gone. All they could hear was the buzzing of flies in the oppressive summer heat. They found William and his sons in the field, lying where they had fallen, the earth around them stained a dark, terrible color. The scene spoke of a swift, merciless violence that left no room for a fight. The men's faces hardened as they approached the cabin. The door hung broken on its hinges, a gaping wound in the side of the small home. Inside was a scene of profound violation. The simple furniture was overturned, and in the dim light they saw what the children had fled from. The overturned cradle, the small, still body of the 3-year-old boy. It was a sight that burned itself into the minds of even the most hardened frontiersmen, turning their fear into a cold, diamond-hard rage. The surviving children were taken in, passed from one set of gentle, grieving hands to another. But they were no longer the children they had been that morning. They were ghosts, haunted by what they had seen and heard. Winnie clung to the infant Elizabeth as if the baby were the last anchor in a world that had been washed away by a flood of violence. Edwin, the 10-year-old boy who had saved them, retreated into a silent, watchful place deep within himself. His eyes held the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and had seen the abyss stare back. The news of the massacre traveled like a shockwave through the scattered settlements of the North Carolina frontier. It was a story told in hushed, terrified whispers around hearths that night. Doors were barred, rifles were loaded, and every shadow in the woods became a source of terror. The fragile illusion of safety was shattered. Dragging Canoe was no longer a distant rumor. He was a tangible, blood-soaked threat who had reached into their world and ripped a family apart. Fear was the first reaction. But in the heart of the Appalachian settler, fear was always followed by something else, a burning, unquenchable thirst for vengeance. The hunt began not with a sheriff's decree, but with a low growl of fury that rippled through the scattered cabins. As the bodies of the Hannons were being prepared for their final rest in the hard Appalachian soil, the men of the frontier were gathering. They came with their long rifles, powder horns, and a quiet, murderous resolve in their eyes. These weren't lawmen. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and trappers whose hands were as accustomed to an axe handle as a trigger. The massacre wasn't an attack on a stranger. It was an attack on every single one of them, on their wives, their children, their own precarious existence. They formed a ragged posse, a grim collection of about 20 men, and plunged into the forest on the trail of the war party. They were skilled woodsmen, men who could read a bent twig or a scuffed patch of moss like a page in a book. But the mountains that had been their home now became an alien landscape, a deadly labyrinth that belonged to their enemy. Every ravine could hide an ambush, every thicket of rhododendron a sniper. The air, thick with humidity, was also thick with a palpable tension that made the sweat on their necks run cold. For days, they pushed deeper into the wilderness, their initial rage sharpening into a focused, exhausting pursuit. They found signs of the war party's passage, the remains of a hastily eaten meal, a single dropped feather from a ceremonial dress, a faint moccasin print in the mud of a creek bed. Each discovery sent a jolt of adrenaline through the weary men, pulling them onward. They were close. They could feel it. They slept in shifts, their rifles never leaving their hands, their dreams filled with shadows and the ghost of a child's scream. But the Chickamauga were masters of this domain. They moved like smoke through the trees, their trail growing fainter and more confusing with every mile. The posse would follow a clear path for hours, only to have it vanish completely on a rocky ridge, as if the warriors had simply been lifted into the sky. The mountains were helping their own. The forest that had provided the Hannons with life was now actively shielding their killers, swallowing them into its vast green depths. The moment of capture never came. After a week of relentless pursuit, the posse stood on a high bluff, looking out over an endless expanse of ridges and valleys. They were gaunt, Their supplies were dwindling, and their tracks were the only ones they had seen for 2 days. The grim truth settled upon them like a shroud. The war party had dissolved back into the wilderness, swallowed by a network of hidden paths and sympathetic villages they could never hope to find. There was no fierce firefight, no exhausted surrender. There was only the cold, bitter realization that the men they were hunting were gone. They had struck and then vanished, leaving nothing behind but corpses and terror. The posse returned to their homesteads, not with prisoners, but with a new, chilling certainty. The war had just begun, and the enemy was a ghost they could not catch. There was no trial, no courtroom, no judge in a black robe, no clever lawyers arguing points of law. To expect such things would be to misunderstand the brutal reality of the frontier in 1776. The courthouses of the new nation were far away, beyond the mountains, and their laws felt as distant and irrelevant as the king across the sea. The men who killed the Hannans were never arrested, never identified, never brought before a jury of their peers. They were simply phantoms who had emerged from the forest and returned to it. The only verdict delivered was the one declared in the hearts of the settlers. The war party that had attacked the Hannans was, in their eyes, guilty beyond any doubt. The evidence was not in testimony, but in the freshly turned earth of 9 graves on a hillside. The sentence was not imprisonment, but death. Death not just to the specific warriors who had wielded the hatchets, but to the entire idea of a shared land. The massacre became a justification, a rallying cry that hardened hearts and erased any lingering thoughts of peaceful coexistence. In the place of a formal trial, there was a trial by rumor and fire. The name of Dragging Canoe became a curse, a name synonymous with savagery and evil. Any Cherokee, whether they followed Dragging Canoe or the peace-seeking chiefs, was now viewed with suspicion and hatred. The act of a single war party was laid at the feet of an entire people. This was the justice of the mountains, swift, absolute, and unforgiving. It wasn't about finding individual culprits, it was about identifying an enemy. The lack of a formal verdict was, in its own way, the most damning verdict of all. It signified that the Hannan family lived and died in a place where the rule of law had not yet taken root. Their lives were governed by a more ancient and brutal code, the code of survival and retribution. The failure of the posse to capture the killers meant there would be no clean resolution, no moment of state-sanctioned justice to close the wound. Instead, the wound was left to fester. It fueled a cycle of retaliatory raids and counter-raids that would stain the Appalachian soil with blood for another 2 decades. A brutal, undeclared war where every man was his own judge, jury, and executioner. What became of the children who ran from a cabin of ghosts? They survived, but they never truly escaped that summer afternoon. They grew up in the shadow of that day, carrying a silence that others could not understand. Legends in these mountains say that Edwin, the boy who had to become a man in a matter of seconds, grew into a hard, quiet frontiersman whose eyes were always scanning the tree line. He was a man forever at war with the memory of what he had lost. Winnie and Elizabeth, the sister and the infant she helped save, grew to become wives and mothers themselves. They built new families, and their bloodline continues to this day, woven into the fabric of Appalachia. But those who knew them said there was always a sadness that never quite left their eyes, a memory of a lullaby that ended in a scream. If you were to go looking for the Hannan homestead today, you wouldn't find it. There is no preserved cabin, no historical marker by the side of the road. The forest has long since swallowed the scar of their small field. The logs of their home have rotted back into the earth from which they came. The only physical trace left is the land itself, and perhaps a few unmarked stones on a forgotten hillside, worn smooth by 2 centuries of rain and wind. But the story did not rot away with the cabin walls. It seeped into the soil like blood, becoming a part of the local folklore. For generations, people living in that hollow have spoken of strange things. They say that on quiet, moonless summer nights, if you stand near the creek where the homestead was, you can sometimes hear the faint, ghostly sound of a baby crying on the wind. It is the soul of the murdered infant, they say, forever lost between worlds. Most people have forgotten the name William Hannon. The official histories mention the event only in passing, if at all. But the mountains remember. The old oaks that witnessed the attack still stand, their rings holding the memory of that day's terrible silence. The story isn't in a book, it's in the land itself. It's a ghost story whispered to children to keep them close to home after dark, a cautionary tale about the brutal cost of a new nation. The paper may have forgotten, but the earth never does. So we return to the question that haunted us from the beginning. How does a family get wiped from the face of the earth, leaving only children to tell the tale? The easy answer is to blame the savagery of the frontier, to point a finger at Dragging Canoe and his warriors. But the truth, like the Appalachian forest itself, is a place of deep and tangled shadows. The Hannon family weren't just killed by men with hatchets. They were caught in the grinding gears of history, crushed between one people's desperate dream for a new life and another people's even more desperate struggle to save their ancient world from disappearing forever. This story is not just an account of a brutal massacre. It is a parable of how America was born. For every noble word written in the Declaration of Independence that summer, there was a silent, bloody chapter being written in a forgotten mountain hollow. It reminds us that progress is never clean, and the foundations of a new world are often laid upon the graves of the old one. The Hannons were pioneers, but they were also trespassers. The Chickamauga were defenders of their homeland, but they were also the agents of a nightmare. There are no simple heroes or villains here. There are only human beings pushed to the limits of their endurance, their fear, and their fury. The real legacy of this tragedy isn't just the ghost of a crying baby on the wind. It's in the resilience of those who survived, the children who ran from hell and somehow managed to build new lives. It is a story not just of cruelty, but of the unyielding strength of the human spirit. It is a wound on the soul of Appalachia that has never fully healed, a quiet reminder that the land we walk on is layered with stories, sorrows, and blood we have long since forgotten. The mountains hold these memories, locked away in their silent, stony heart. They remember the laughter of children in a sunlit field, the chilling war cry that shattered the peace, and the terrible silence that followed. And now, my friends, so do you. In the deepest folds of the Appalachian Mountains, there are valleys and hollows that have names. Names whispered by the old folks. Names like Moan Hollow. They say it wasn't the wind that gave it that name. It was the sorrow that soaked into the ground, a sorrow that belonged to one family, the Howards. For generations, their story was told not in letters, but in bruises and broken bones. A rage passed from father to son, as sure as their blue eyes and stubborn chin. The legends say it was a curse, a witch's dying breath, or a deal made with the devil in a dark coal mine. But what if the truth is something colder, something more terrifying than any ghost story? What if the monster wasn't a spirit from the woods, but a demon that lived right inside their own home, passed down like a family heirloom? Today, we will separate the rumors from the facts and find out what really happened to the men of the Howard family. Was it a curse that doomed them, or was it a chain of pain they forged themselves? Before it was called Moan Hollow, it was just a nameless fold in the earth, a sanctuary carved by a silver creek. The mountains rose up on all sides like silent green-robed giants, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual blue haze. It was a true oasis, hidden in the wild and rugged lands. The forests were thick with chestnut and oak, teeming with deer and turkey. The soil in the narrow bottomland was black and rich. It was a place where a man willing to work until his hands bled could build a life from nothing, and that's exactly what Jedediah Howard came to do. He was the first of them, a man who carried the chill of the Scottish Highlands in his bones and a fierce hunger in his heart. He'd left the old world behind, a world of landlords and famines, and saw in this untamed Appalachian wilderness a kingdom waiting to be claimed. He was a hard man, to be sure, with eyes as cold and clear as a winter stream, but his toughness was first turned against the land itself. He felled trees that were ancient when his grandfather was a boy. He broke the soil with his own back, and he raised a small, sturdy cabin stone by stone. For a time, there was peace in that hollow. Jedediah took a wife, a quiet woman named Elspeth, and soon the silence of the valley was broken by the cry of their firstborn son, Silas. Their life was a rhythm of seasons and survival. They were governed by the rising of the sun and the ache in their muscles. They feared the hard frost and the dry summer, but they feared little else. They were poor, but their barn was full. They were isolated, but they were self-sufficient. Jedediah had done it. He had carved out a piece of the world that was his, and his alone. But the mountains keep secrets. And the story the neighbors told was that this piece of the world hadn't been empty when Jedediah arrived. They said an old Cherokee woman had lived there, a healer who knew the secrets of the herbs that grew in the dark places of the woods. The official record says Jedediah bought the land fair and square, a simple transaction. But the whispers said something different. They said the deal was less of a purchase and more of an eviction. They said she didn't leave quietly. And so, a shadow lingered at the edge of their hard-won peace. Sometimes, Elspeth would swear she saw a flicker of movement by the ancient oak at the edge of the property. At night, when the fire burned low, the wind blowing through the gorge would sometimes sound like a mournful voice, a lament. Jedediah Howard had built his home, but he didn't know that the foundation was laid on a grievance. He believed he had conquered the wilderness, but he hadn't yet learned that some debts aren't paid with money, but with blood. The storm was gathering, and it would bear his family's name. Now, in the mountains, a good neighbor is worth more than a good mule, but Jedediah Howard never found one. The closest family, the Suttrys, lived a mile down the creek, and they looked upon Jedediah's prosperity with a sour eye. The patriarch, Elias Suttry, was a man whose family had been hunting and trapping in these hills for 2 generations before the Howards arrived. He told anyone who would listen that the fertile bottomland Jedediah had claimed was promised to him, that he'd been on the verge of filing the deed himself. The Suttrys felt the land had been stolen right from under them, and their resentment simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. The old wound festered over a property line. A small creek separated their lands, and after a spring flood one year, the water changed its course, carving a new channel that gave a few more acres of rich soil to the Howards. To Jedediah, it was an act of God. To Elias Suttry, it was theft by water and a sign of Howard's devil's luck. It came to a head at the crossroads store, where words, sharp and heavy as stones, were thrown. No punches were exchanged, not yet, but a line was drawn. Suttry swore that creek would one day run with more than just rainwater. It wasn't spoken of loudly after that, but memories in the mountains are as long as a winter's night. This bitter dispute was the dry kindling, and the legend of the Cherokee woman was the spark. The Suttrys and their kin started repeating the story, adding their own dark embellishments. When one of Jedediah's cows took sick and died, it wasn't colic, it was the curse. When a late frost killed the Howards' apple blossoms, it wasn't the weather, it was the witch's revenge. The story of the curse became a social weapon, isolating the Howards and marking them as other. People who had once nodded a greeting now looked away. The Howard land, once seen as a testament to hard work, was now viewed as a place of bad blood. And so, the hollow became a pressure cooker. Inside the Howard cabin, the whispers from the outside world turned Jedediah's heart to granite. He saw enemies in every shadow. His wife Elspeth grew more withdrawn, her silence a constant, fearful prayer. And young Silas, he was being raised on a diet of resentment and suspicion. His father taught him to read the weather and to mend a fence, but the real lessons were unspoken. He learned that the world was hostile. He learned that a Howard trusts no one but another Howard. And he learned that any sign of weakness would be seized upon by your enemies. He was being forged in a crucible of suspicion and pride, being shaped into the perfect instrument to carry the family's legacy, whether it was a blessing or a curse. The harvest festival that year was supposed to be a time of truce. For one day, families set aside their grievances to celebrate the bounty of the land. There was music from a fiddle and banjo, the sweet smell of roasting meat, and the amber glow of moonshine being passed in a jar. And in that brief moment of peace, a dangerous seed took root. Silas Howard, now a young man with his father's solid build but his mother's quiet eyes, saw Sarah Suttree. She was Elias Suttree's youngest daughter, and a young man's heart doesn't care much for property lines or old grudges. They stole glances across the crowd, their secret a fragile spark in the midst of a simmering hate. That spark became a fire when the dancing started. Under the light of the harvest moon, Silas asked Sarah to dance. It was a reckless, defiant act. For the length of one song, they were just a boy and a girl, lost in the music, the world of their fathers fading away. But it was a world that wouldn't be ignored. Sarah's two older brothers, Caleb and Joshua, saw it all. They were their father's sons through and through, barrel-chested and quick to anger, and they saw a Howard's hands on their sister as the ultimate trespass. The music hadn't even finished before they pulled Sarah away and cornered Silas behind the barn. The first words weren't about the dance. They were about the land, the creek, the old rumors. They called him the son of a thief and a witch lover. They sneered that the curse was already showing in his eyes. Silas, raised on a strict diet of Howard pride, stood his ground. He didn't say a word, but his silence was louder than any shout. The taunts escalated, his family's name dragged through the mud with every curse. Then Joshua Suttree shoved him hard against the rough-hewn planks of the barn wall. Silas shoved back, and the festival was over. It was 2 against 1, a brutal, clumsy fight fueled by moonshine and generations of bad blood. Silas was strong, but they were stronger. They beat him to his knees, his face in the dirt. But as Caleb raised a heavy boot to stomp his hand, Silas's desperate eyes landed on a heavy wooden mallet left behind from setting up the tents. With a guttural roar, he lunged, swinging the mallet in a blind arc. There was a sickening crack of wood against bone. Caleb Suttree collapsed to the ground, his arm bent at an unnatural angle, a shard of white bone peeking through his skin. Blood, dark in the moonlight, soaked into the dry earth. The screams that followed silenced the fiddle for good. The community scattered, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. Elias Suttree, his face a mask of pure fury, cradled his screaming son and pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "You'll pay for this, Howard," he choked out. "Your whole damned family will pay." Back in his own cabin that night, Jedediah didn't tend to his son's cuts and bruises. He looked at the blood on Silas's knuckles, at the fire in his eyes, and saw not a mistake, but a beginning. The whispers were over. The time for waiting was done. In both the Howard and Suttree homes that night, rifles were taken down from the wall and carefully, methodically cleaned. The first drops of blood had fallen, watering the seeds of a war that would consume them all. The revenge came not with a warning, but with the quiet mist of the following dawn. Jedediah Howard was at the woodpile, the rhythmic thud of his axe, a familiar heartbeat in the hollow. He was splitting kindling for the morning fire, a simple, honest chore. The air was still and damp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and wet earth. Then came a sound that didn't belong, a sharp crack that wasn't a breaking branch. The axe fell from Jedediah's hand, its blade burying itself in the dirt. He crumpled without a sound, a slow, heavy fall onto the very soil he had claimed as his own. From the cabin, Elspeth heard it. A mother's instinct, a wife's dread. She threw open the rough-hewn door, her question dying on her lips as she saw the dark shapes of Elias Suttree and his son Joshua emerging from the tree line, rifles in hand. The air filled with a blood-curdling scream, and then there was a dull thud, and the scream was cut short. A second crack echoed the first. Then an unnatural silence fell over the hollow, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all other sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of the birds, everything. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing quiet. Silas was down by the creek, checking a rabbit snare he'd set the night before. He heard the two shots, spaced just far enough apart to be deliberate. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He didn't think, he ran. He sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at his face, his lungs burning. As he broke through the clearing, the sight of his home stopped him cold. The cabin door was swinging wide open, like a gaping mouth. There were no voices, no movement. The chickens were scattered across the yard, clucking in frantic terror. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was the silence of a place where life had just been violently erased. He crept inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The single room was a scene of pure chaos. A table was overturned, chairs were splintered. A sack of flour had been torn open, casting a ghostly white powder over everything. And there, in the middle of the floor, a single dark boot print was pressed into the spilled flour. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a splash of crimson against the stark white. Near the cold hearth, his mother's favorite wool shawl, the one she was always mending, was cast aside in a heap. He backed out of the cabin, a silent denial screaming in his mind. And then he saw him. His father lay near the woodpile, a place of work, of life. He looked smaller somehow. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the misty sky he would never see again. The world for Silas shrank to that single still image. His father, the unmovable mountain of a man, now just a broken thing on the ground. In that moment, something inside Silas Howard broke. Or perhaps something was forged. The fear, the grief, it was all there, but it was instantly flash-frozen by a rage so pure and cold it burned. The tears would not come. The boy who had danced with Sarah Suttree under the harvest moon was gone, buried in the ashes of his home. In his place stood the son of Jedediah Howard, a vessel for a generation of hate, now filled to the brim. He didn't run to his father. He didn't cry out his mother's name. He walked, slowly and deliberately, to the woodpile. He looked down at his father's still face, the face that had taught him that the world was a hard and unforgiving place. Then he bent down. His hand closed around the smooth, worn handle of the fallen axe. As he lifted it, its weight felt familiar, righteous. The curse, whether real or imagined, had found its new champion. Silas Howard stood alone in the clearing, the axe in his hand feeling less like a tool and more like a part of his own arm. He did not weep. Tears were a luxury, and the price of vengeance was paid in sweat and resolve. With a grim, mechanical determination, he went to the small barn and retrieved 2 shovels. He chose a spot under the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the one his mother had always admired. And he began to dig. For hours, the only sound in Moan Hollow was the scrape and thud of a shovel biting into the earth, a solitary, heartbreaking rhythm. He carried his parents, one by one, and laid them to rest. He filled the graves himself, tamping down the soil with the back of his shovel, his movements precise and unhurried. There were no prayers said, no final words spoken. The act itself was the only eulogy. When the grim task was done, he did not go back into the cabin. He stood at the threshold and looked in at the scene of desecration, the spilled flour, the broken furniture, his mother's discarded shawl. This was no longer his home. It was a monument to a promise, a promise made in blood. He turned his back on it, leaving the door to swing on its hinges, an open invitation for the wind and the rain to come in and reclaim the place. He took only his father's rifle from the wall, a pouch of shot, a powder horn, and the axe. He walked away from the hollow without a single look back, melting into the deep woods that bordered his land. The hollow fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of a tomb. Word travels slowly in the mountains, but it travels surely. A few days later, a traveling preacher making his circuit found the Howard homestead unnervingly quiet. He saw the two fresh mounds of earth under the oak tree and knew instantly what they were. He didn't linger. He spurred his horse and carried the news to the nearest settlement. The story spread like a fever. It wasn't the killing that shocked people. Feuds and violence were a known part of life. It was the manner of it. The killing of a woman. An ambush at dawn. It was an act without honor, and it struck a chord of fear in the scattered community. Families who had feuds of their own looked at their neighbors with new eyes. Locks were bolted that had never been used before. The county sheriff, a portly man named Abernathy, who preferred settling disputes with talk rather than a gun, eventually made the ride out to the hollow. He saw the graves, noted the abandoned cabin, and then paid a visit to the Suttree family. Elias and his sons met him on their porch, their faces like stone masks. They denied everything. They'd been tending their own land, they said, and hadn't seen a soul. With no witnesses and no bodies to examine, Sheriff Abernathy's hands were tied. He made some notes in a dusty ledger, issued a stern warning about mountain justice, and rode away. The law in those mountains moved with the speed of an old man walking uphill, and in this case, it had come to a dead stop. But the story wasn't over. The community knew it. The Suttrees certainly knew it. Silas Howard was gone, but he wasn't dead. He had been swallowed by the mountains, the same ancient, unforgiving wilderness that had forged his father. He was out there, somewhere in the endless ridges and dark ravines. The manhunt had begun, but it wasn't the law that was doing the hunting. A ghost was now stalking Moan Hollow, and Elias Suttree and his sons began to understand that the two shots they had fired at dawn were not an ending, but the beginning of a reckoning. Every snapped twig in the woods, every shadow that moved at dusk, now held a terrifying new possibility. Silas Howard was no longer a name, but a whisper on the wind. There was no posse. Sheriff Abernathy had declared the matter closed, a family tragedy best left to the ghosts and the mountains. The hunt that began was a far more personal and primal affair. Elias Suttree and his remaining sons, Joshua and the one-armed Caleb, became both the hunters and the hunted. Their farm became a fortress, and they became its prisoners. They barred the windows at night and took turns standing watch, rifles cradled in their arms, their gazes fixed on the dark, whispering tree line that separated them from their unseen enemy. They were hunting a ghost, a boy they had created and then unleashed. But Silas Howard was no ghost. He was flesh and blood, and he was perfectly at home. The mountains that the Suttrees now saw as a terrifying wall of shadow, Silas saw as his sanctuary and his accomplice. He had been raised in these woods. He knew the hidden game trails, the secret springs, the shallow caves where a man could disappear. The mountains had taken Silas Howard in, adopted him as one of their own. He moved like a deer, lived off the land, and his senses became as sharp as a hawk's. He became a roomer with a rifle, a phantom whose presence was felt in the cold dread that settled over the Suttree homestead. Silas did not launch a direct assault. He was waging a war not on their bodies, but on their minds. The torment began with small, deliberate cruelties. One morning, Elias found a freshly killed rabbit hanging from his porch rail, skinned with the same distinctive knife stroke his own father had taught him. A few nights later, a rock shattered the kitchen window in the dead of night, and when they rushed outside, there was nothing but the chirping of crickets. They started hearing things, The distant rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood deep in the forest, a low whistle on the wind that sounded like a tune Silas used to favor. He was everywhere and nowhere, a constant, invisible pressure that began to fray their nerves raw. The Sutri brothers, once bold and arrogant, became twitchy and paranoid. Caleb, his useless arm a constant reminder of the feud's beginning, was consumed by nightmares. Joshua, the more hot-headed of the two, grew reckless with fury. He'd fire his rifle into the shadows at the slightest sound, his shouts echoing unanswered in the night. The forest that had been his backyard his entire life was now a deadly labyrinth with a monster at its center. The father, Elias, saw his sons unraveling and his own iron will turning to rust. The fear was a poison, and Silas was letting it work its way deep into their souls before he delivered the final blow. The breaking point came a month into the siege. Driven by a mix of rage and cabin fever, Joshua Sutri declared he was going to hunt the hunter. Ignoring his father's pleas, he took his rifle and stormed into the woods, vowing to return with Silas Howard's scalp. He stalked through the familiar forest for hours, his anger making him clumsy, his shouts making him an easy target. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, he found himself in a part of the woods he didn't recognize. A sudden snap of a twig behind him made him spin around. He saw nothing. A cold dread, colder than any winter morning, washed over him. He knew in that instant that he was not the hunter. He was the prey, and he had walked right into the center of the web. They found him at dawn, not 50 yards from his own tree line. Elias Sutri, his face a pale, haggard mask, followed the trail of broken branches his son had left. He didn't find a man. He found what was left. Joshua was slumped against the base of a massive pine tree. There was no sign of a struggle, no gunshot wound. A single dark mark on his temple showed where the butt of a rifle had struck with brutal final force. But it was the other detail that made Elias's blood run cold. Lying neatly on Joshua's chest was the family axe, the one Silas had taken from his father's woodpile. Its blade was clean. It had not been used to kill, but to send a message. One Sutri was down. The ghost had a taste for blood, and his work was not yet finished. There was no trial held in the county courthouse for the death of Joshua Sutri. The only court in session was the court of public opinion, and the verdict was delivered in hushed tones and averted eyes. When Elias and Caleb carried the pine box to the small family plot on the hill behind their house, only a handful of distant cousins came to stand with them. The rest of the community stayed away, their absence a silent, damning judgment. They weren't mourning Joshua, they were watching the Sutri family be consumed by a fire of their own making. The law of men had failed, and now the older, harsher law of the mountains was handing down its sentence. The Sutri homestead became a courtroom and a prison all in one. Elias and Caleb were the accused, and Silas Howard was the unseen judge, jury, and executioner. The farm began to die around them. Fences sagged, weeds choked the cornfields, and the livestock grew thin from neglect. How could they work the fields when their eyes were constantly scanning the tree line? How could they sleep when every creak of the floorboards sounded like an intruder? Elias, the once proud patriarch who ruled his family with an iron fist, was reduced to a hollow-eyed old man, watching his world crumble one terror at a time. The legacy he had fought to build was being systematically dismantled by the ghost of a boy he had wronged. Caleb, however, was haunted by more than just fear. With his useless dangling arm, a constant aching reminder of his role in starting the feud, his spirit began to break. He started drinking heavily, seeking courage in a jar of corn liquor that only brought forth the demons of his guilt. In his drunken stupors, he would whisper his mother-in-law's name, swearing he saw her face in the shadows. He raved about a curse, not the one they had mockingly pinned on the Howards, but a real one, a curse of blood they had brought upon themselves that day at dawn. The trial within the Suttree home reached its climax one moonless night. Fueled by whiskey and terror, Caleb finally turned on his father. He stood in the middle of the cabin, his one good hand trembling, and screamed the truth into the suffocating silence. He shrieked about the look in Elspeth Howard's eyes, about the silence after the second shot, about the blood on their hands that would never wash away. "It's him. He's not a man. He's a spirit. And he's come for us." Elias tried to silence him, to slap the hysteria out of him, but the dam of denial had burst. The truth, ugly and raw, now filled the space between them. The verdict was delivered just before the next sunrise. Caleb Suttree, stripped of his bravado and his sanity, seemed to find a strange and sudden calm. He walked out onto the porch, unarmed, his face pale in the grey pre-dawn light. He took a deep breath of the cold mountain air, and then, in a voice that was not a shout, but a weary plea, he called out a single name into the mist-shrouded woods. Silas. He stood there, a man offering himself up to the inevitable. A moment passed, then another. And then, from the dark, silent wall of trees, a single shot rang out, sharp and final. It was an answer, an execution, a mercy. Was this justice? A circuit judge would have called it murder. But in the hollows and hills, where life was cheap and honor was everything, the story was told differently. They said Silas Howard was simply balancing the scales. He had taken an eye for an eye, a son for a mother, a brother for a father. Elias Suttree was now utterly alone, a king of a dead and haunted kingdom, left to live with the ghosts he had created. The law of men had never laid a hand on him, but the justice of the mountains had delivered a sentence far worse than a hangman's noose. It had taken everything. Elias Suttree didn't die from a bullet. He died from silence. He lived out his remaining years in that hollow, a ghost in his own home, surrounded by the ghosts of his sons. His land went fallow, and his name withered on the vine. When he finally passed, no one was there to mark the occasion. The Suttree line, once a source of pride, ended in a weedy, forgotten grave on a lonely hillside. Their story became a cautionary tale about the price of hate. And Silas Howard, the avenging angel of the hollow, walked out of the mountains and into a bigger, bloodier war. When the nation split apart, he joined the Union Army, perhaps seeing in the chaos of the Civil War a place where a man with his particular skills could belong. He saw the horrors of Gettysburg, a slaughter that made his family feud look like a schoolyard scuffle. But the war didn't wash away his sins. It just baptized him in a new kind of hell. He returned a broken man, quiet and cold, the fire of righteous vengeance replaced by the hollow emptiness of trauma. It was this Silas, the soldier with the haunted eyes, who would eventually take a wife and have a son of his own, passing down not a name, but a darkness. The curse had found its vessel for the next generation. If you were to go looking for Moan Hollow today, you wouldn't find it on any map. But the locals could point the way. The Suttree place is gone, reclaimed entirely by the forest, a place where people say the weeds grow a little too thick and the birds sing a little less sweetly. The Howard cabin was swallowed by the woods too. All that remains today is a pile of moss-covered foundation stones and a single stubborn chimney standing like a tombstone for a home. They call it the Howard Chimney now, a local landmark where teenagers dare each other to spend the night. And the 2 mounds of earth under the ancient oak tree? They are still there, sunken and subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But they are there. The paper trail of this tragedy is thin, a few lines in a dusty county ledger about a land dispute. But the mountains have a longer memory. The story of the Howards and the Suttrees isn't written in ink. It's carved into the landscape itself, in the names people whisper, in the ruins they avoid after dark. Though most people have forgotten the details, the sorrow has soaked into the soil and the mountains remember everything. So we come back to the question that started it all, the question whispered around campfires in these mountains for over a century. Was the Howard family doomed by a supernatural curse? It's a powerful story, the idea of a witch's hex or a deal with the devil. It gives a name to an evil that feels too big and too relentless to be human. But the truth, as it often is simpler and somehow far more tragic. The real curse wasn't a whisper on the wind. The real curse was the silence between neighbors nursing old grudges, the silence of a man who can't speak his pain, and the ringing, final silence after a gunshot. This is a story not just of cruelty, but of the formidable, unyielding Appalachian spirit, a spirit forged in hardship and isolation. It's a story of the fierce pride that can build a life on a steep mountainside with nothing but bare hands, and the terrible pride that can tear that same life apart over a single insult. The Howards weren't monsters. They were men, trapped in a cage built by poverty, ignorance, and trauma. Each generation inherited the pain of the last, and the only tool they were ever given to deal with that pain was rage. Silas Howard didn't learn his violence from a demon in a mine. He learned it in the silence of a father who never showed him love, and in the screams of a mother he couldn't protect. The names on the headstones have faded, and the cabins have crumbled back into the earth, but the lesson of Moan Hollow remains, a quiet warning carried on the mountain breeze. It teaches us that the most terrible ghosts are the ones we create ourselves, the ones that live inside our own families. The story of the Howards is a bitter parable about how a man can escape a war, can escape a hollow, but can never truly escape the legacy of his father's hands. And now, my friends, you know the story of Moan Hollow. And you know why the old folks say, even on a still day, the wind in that valley still sounds a little like weeping.